I opened the door to my lavish birthday party, only to see everyone cheering and clapping as my wife's rich CEO proposes to her. Say yes, say yes. Everyone screamed. You need an alpha man, he said. So I walked away, canceled every payment, and pulled out my 90% company share $157 million worth. Minutes later, my phone lit up with 256 missed calls, and someone showed up at my door. You know what they say about turning 40? That it's supposed to be some kind of milestone, a moment where you look back at your life and feel satisfied with what you've built. Well, standing in the Ritzwood Grand Ballroom with its crystal chandeliers dripping like frozen tears and marble floors so polished you could perform surgery on them, I thought I was about to have one of those hallmark moments. The kind where your loving wife surprises you with all your closest friends and business associates. Everyone raises a toast, and you feel like you've actually made it in this dog-eat-dog world we call corporate America. Boy, was I wrong. Like, spectacularly, catastrophically, should have seen it coming from orbit wrong. The evening started innocently enough. Clarraine had been acting mysterious for weeks, whispering into her phone in that breathy way she does when she's planning something elaborate. I figured she was organizing another one of her over-the-top social events. The woman could turn a trip to Starbucks into a production worthy of Broadway. But hey, after 15 years of marriage, you learn to appreciate the effort, even when it comes with a price tag that could feed a small village for a month. I'd even brought her a gift tonight. A diamond necklace that cost more than most people's cars, wrapped in Tiffany blue with a card that read something embarrassingly sappy about how she made every day worth celebrating. Real Lifetime movie stuff, but I meant every word. That's the thing about being married to someone for a decade and a half. You start to believe in the fairy tale, even when the fairy tale costs you a fortune in designer gowns and spa weekends in the Hamptons. The ballroom was packed with faces I recognized from the tech world. Investors, board members, employees from Clarigen Technologies, the company I'd built from the ground up with nothing but my grandmother's inheritance and more sleepless nights than I care to count. Everyone was dressed to the nines, champagne glasses glittering under those ridiculous chandeliers, conversations buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes from an open bar and expensive hors d'oeuvres. But something felt off. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, call it the same gut instinct that had helped me turn a garage startup into a $157 million empire. But the crowd wasn't looking at me. Hell, half of them weren't even acknowledging I existed, which is pretty impressive considering it was supposedly my birthday party. Instead, they were all facing the center of the ballroom like they were watching some kind of performance. That's when I saw him. Victor Langford, Clarraine CEO at the company I'd foolishly let her run while I focused on the technical side. The guy was everything I wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that looks like it was chiseled by Michelangelo himself. He had that whole alpha male thing going on that makes middle-aged women swoon and makes guys like me feel like we should be checking our stock portfolios for reassurance. But it wasn't Victor's presence that made my blood run cold. It was his position. The bastard was down on one knee, holding up a diamond ring the size of a small planet, and the crowd, my crowd, at my birthday party, was chanting like they were at a freaking football game. Say yes, they shouted, their voices echoing off the marble walls like some kind of twisted prayer. And there was Clarraine, standing over him with this expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't surprise, wasn't shock, wasn't even confusion. It was pure, radiant joy, the kind of happiness that only comes from getting exactly what you've been wanting for a very long time. She looked like a woman who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment, and that's when it hit me. She had been waiting. This wasn't some spontaneous romantic gesture. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the script. Victor looked up at her with that smug grin he usually reserved for board meetings where he'd managed to increase his budget by another few million. You need an alpha man, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd laughed like it was the punchline to some inside joke I wasn't in on. Which, apparently, I wasn't. I stood there holding my gift like an idiot, watching my wife of 15 years beam down at another man like he'd just offered her the moon on a silver platter. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that stung like hell. The worst part was realizing that this moment felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced it in front of a mirror. When she whispered yes, in that breathy, theatrical way she used when she wanted to sound spontaneous, I knew without a doubt that this whole thing had been planned down to the last detail. The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to go on forever, champagne glasses clinking, camera phones flashing, everyone treating this like it was the social event of the season. Which, I suppose it was. Just not the kind I'd been expecting when I put on my best suit and drove to what I thought was my own birthday celebration. Here's the thing about moments like this. You have two choices. You can make a scene, you can beg and plead and make yourself look even more pathetic than you already do, or you can maintain whatever dignity you have left and walk away with your head held high. I've seen guys in similar situations choose the first option, and it never ends well. They become cautionary tales, memes on social media, the kind of stories people tell at dinner parties when they want to make everyone feel uncomfortable. So I did what I do best in crisis situations. I compartmentalized. I treated it like a hostile takeover, like a board meeting where the numbers don't add up and you need to cut your losses before they get worse. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even raise my voice. I simply turned around and walked out of that ballroom with the same calm composure I'd used leaving any other business meeting that had gone sideways. The valet brought my car around without comment, though I could see the pity in his eyes. Word travels fast in places like this, especially when it involves public humiliation and diamond rings the size of golf balls. I tipped him anyway, no point in taking out my frustration on someone just trying to make a living. But as I sat in my car, watching the Ritzwood Grand's elegant facade in my rearview mirror, something clicked in my brain. It was the same feeling I'd had 20 years ago when I first realized I could turn code into money, when I understood that the right algorithm at the right time could change everything. My mind sharpened, focused, like a lens coming into perfect clarity. This was the moment I stopped financing my own humiliation. I pulled out my phone and logged into Clarigen's financial system, the same system I'd built from scratch and still controlled with my 90% ownership stake. All those years of letting Clarraine play CEO while I handled the real work. All those times I'd signed off on her expenses without question because I trusted her. All of it was about to change. My finger hovered over the screen, over the controls that would freeze every account, halt every transaction, lock down every aspect of the company's financial operations. $157 million in assets. All of it traced back to patents I'd filed, algorithms I'd created, and investments I'd made with my own money and my grandmother's inheritance. One click, and everything would freeze. One click, and the party would be over for real. You know what's funny about revenge? Everyone thinks it's this hot, impulsive thing. Like you're supposed to go off half-cocked, making dramatic gestures and burning bridges while screaming about justice. But real revenge, the kind that actually works, is cold as a Minnesota winter and twice as calculated. It's paperwork, not pyrotechnics. And right now, sitting in my home office at 3 in the morning, I was about to serve up a dish that had been 20 years in the making. My office is the one room in this penthouse that Clarraine never got her perfectly manicured hands on. While she was busy turning the rest of our home into some kind of interior design magazine fever dream. All white marble and gold accents that screamed, "Look how much money we have." I kept this space exactly how I wanted it. Dark mahogany walls, leather chairs that actually looked lived in, and bookshelves filled with technical manuals instead of the decorative nonsense she favored. No crystal vases, no abstract art that cost more than most people's mortgages, just a place where a man could think without feeling like he was living in a museum. The wall safe sat behind a painting of my grandmother, the only family portrait Clarraine couldn't convince me to replace with something more contemporary. Grandma Rose would have taken one look at tonight's circus and laughed until her teeth fell out. She always said that fancy people were just regular people wearing expensive masks, and boy, was she right about that. The woman who taught me that real wealth comes from owning things that matter, not from looking like you do. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing the black folder I hadn't touched in months. Foundations, I'd labeled it, because that's what it contained. The bedrock of everything I'd built. The paper trail that proved beyond any shadow of doubt who really owned what in this little empire of mine. Clarraine might have been the face of Clarigen Technologies, the one giving interviews to tech magazines and posing for Forbes covers, but ownership? That was a completely different story. I spread the documents across my desk like a lawyer preparing for the trial of the century. The original incorporation papers, filed 23 years ago when I was still young enough to believe that hard work automatically led to success and naive enough to think that people wouldn't try to steal what you'd earned. My signature, clear as day, claiming 90% ownership. Victor's name was nowhere to be found. Hell, the guy was probably still in college, learning how to charm his way through business school, while I was pulling all-nighters writing the code that would eventually make us all rich. Then came the patent filings, page after page of them, each one representing months of work, breakthrough moments that came at 2 in the morning when everyone else was sleeping. The emotion recognition algorithms that made our AI so damn good at understanding human behavior. The data compression techniques that let us process information faster than anyone else in the industry. The security protocols that kept our clients' information safer than Fort Knox. Every single one filed under my name. Every single one funded with money I'd earned or inherited. And there it was, the paper that told the real story, the transfer documentation showing how I'd seeded the company with my life savings and my grandmother's inheritance. $200,000 that represented every penny I had in the world, plus another $300,000 from the woman who'd raised me after my parents decided that raising a kid was too much work. $500,000 that turned into $157 million over 2 decades of smart decisions, brutal work schedules, and the kind of calculated risks that keep you awake at night wondering if you've just bet everything on the wrong horse. Clarraine had contributed exactly $0 to the initial investment. Her name appeared on the incorporation papers as a 10% shareholder, a wedding gift I'd given her when we got married because I was young and stupid and thought that love meant sharing everything. Victor, the man currently wearing my wife's engagement ring, had contributed nothing but a business school degree and the kind of smooth-talking confidence that impresses people who don't know the difference between actual leadership and expensive haircuts. But here's the beautiful thing about legal documents. They don't give a damn about your feelings. They don't care if you've been humiliated in front of 200 people. Don't care if your wife is currently celebrating her engagement to another man. Don't care if you feel like your entire life has been turned into some kind of reality TV show. They just state facts, cold and clear and absolutely indisputable. I own 90% of a company worth $157 million. Victor owned 0%. Clarraine owned 10% that was looking more and more like collateral for what I was about to do to both of them. Time to put those facts to work. The first call I made was to our bank, using the emergency line that comes with having 8 figures in various accounts. Amazing how quickly they pick up when you're calling about freezing that much money. Mr. Monroe, the night manager said, and I could practically hear him sitting up straighter. How can we assist you this evening? I need to freeze all corporate accounts for Clarigen Technologies, effective immediately, I said, keeping my voice as calm as if I were ordering a sandwich. Security concern. Potential fraud. Of course, sir. May I ask? You may not. I cut him off. This is under my authority as majority shareholder and chief financial officer. The paperwork will be on your desk in the morning. Next came the credit cards. Corporate accounts that had been funding Clarraine's lifestyle for years. Private jets to wine country, shopping trips to Milan, spa weekends that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every single one frozen with a phone call. Let's see how quickly Victor's alpha male routine holds up when his new fiancée can't afford her morning latte without asking daddy for an allowance. The luxury trips were next. That weekend in Napa they'd been planning. The one where I wasn't invited because I was supposedly too focused on work to appreciate the finer things. Cancelled. The reservations at Le Bernardin for their celebration dinner? Gone. The suite at the plaza they'd booked for their engagement weekend? Available for someone else to enjoy. But the real masterpiece was freezing the payroll system. Not the employees' salaries. I'm not a monster, and the people actually doing the work deserve to get paid. But the executive bonuses, the consulting fees, the mysterious business development expenses that had been bleeding the company dry for months, all of it stopped with the push of a button. I leaned back in my chair and waited. In the corporate world, money is like blood, cut off the flow, and you find out real quick which parts of the body are actually essential and which parts are just along for the ride. Clarraine and Victor were about to discover that they'd been living high on someone else's dime, and that someone had just decided the party was over. My phone lit up first, 256 missed calls in the space of an hour, which had to be some kind of record. Text messages flooded in like water through a broken dam, each one more frantic than the last. But the real confirmation that my message had been received came from the intercom system. Patrick Doyle, the night concierge, sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Mr. Monroe? I apologize for the late hour, but there's a young woman downstairs who says she works for your wife. She seems quite distressed. Says it's urgent. Should I send her up? I smiled for the first time all evening. The messenger had arrived. There's something almost biblical about watching a carefully constructed lie crumble in real time. You know, like those old stories where the mighty fall and the meek inherit the earth. Except in this version, the mighty are wearing designer dresses and the inheritance is a tech company worth 9 figures. Standing at my penthouse door at 4:15 in the morning, I was about to witness the first act of what I was already thinking of as the Clorane collapse, a financial disaster that would make the Hindenburg look like a successful landing. Elisa Vargas looked like she'd been through a blender set to corporate nightmare. Clorane's assistant. Excuse me, executive coordinator, because God forbid anyone in that woman's orbit have a job title that didn't sound like it required an MBA. Stood in my hallway clutching a coffee cup like it was the last life preserver on the Titanic. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged in ways that suggested either a complete breakdown or a very long night of ugly crying. Possibly both. The poor kid couldn't have been more than 25, fresh out of some overpriced college with dreams of climbing the corporate ladder in her sensible heels and carefully curated young professional wardrobe. Right now, though, she looked like someone had just explained to her that Santa Claus wasn't real, the tooth fairy was a lie, and her boss was about to become unemployed in the most spectacular way possible. Mr. Monroe, she stammered, and I could practically hear her mental script falling apart in real time. I'm so sorry to bother you at this hour, but Mrs. Monroe sent me to discuss what she's calling a technical glitch with the company's financial systems. Technical glitch. That was rich. Like calling the bombing of Pearl Harbor a navigation error, or describing the Titanic as having minor ice-related complications. But I had to admire Clorane's optimism. Even when her entire world was collapsing around her designer shoes, she was still trying to spin it as some kind of innocent mistake that could be fixed with the right combination of charm and denial. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let her into the apartment. Can I get you some coffee? You look like you could use it. Or maybe something stronger. It's been a long night for all of us. Elisa shook her head, but I could see her hands trembling as she clutched that coffee cup. Poor kid probably hadn't slept in 24 hours, running around trying to put out fires that kept multiplying faster than she could handle them. This is what happens when you work for people who build their entire empire on someone else's foundation. Eventually, the owner decides to reclaim his property, and everyone caught in the middle gets crushed. She asked me to tell you that the payroll system has frozen. Elisa continued, reading from what looked like notes scribbled on a napkin. The investor meeting for tomorrow morning had to be canceled because the conference room reservation was declined. Mr. Langford's corporate credit cards are showing as suspended, and the accounts payable system is locked down completely. I nodded thoughtfully, like this was all news to me instead of the carefully orchestrated financial apocalypse I'd been orchestrating from my home office for the past 3 hours. Sounds like a pretty comprehensive technical glitch, I said. Almost like someone with system administrator access decided to shut everything down simultaneously. But that couldn't be right. Something like that would require someone with majority ownership and executive authority. The color drained from Elisa's face as the implications hit her. She might be young, but she wasn't stupid. She'd been working closely enough with Clorane to understand the company's power structure, even if her boss had been pretending it was different than reality. Mrs. Monroe is hoping you might be able to fix the situation, she said carefully, like she was walking through a minefield in high heels. She mentioned that you have some technical expertise in this area. I do indeed, I replied, walking over to my desk and pulling out a manila envelope I'd prepared while waiting for this exact conversation. In fact, I've already diagnosed the problem and prepared a comprehensive solution. Would you like to hear it? Elisa nodded, though she looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Maybe getting a root canal, or audited by the IRS, or explaining to her parents why she'd chosen to work for people who were about to become the laughingstock of the tech industry. I opened the envelope and pulled out 7 pages of legal documentation that had taken me exactly 43 minutes to draft and would take Clarraine considerably longer to digest. The technical glitch, as your boss calls it, is actually the system working exactly as designed. You see, when someone owns 90% of a company but allows other people to spend money like it's monopoly cash, eventually the owner might decide to reassert control over his assets. I handed her the papers, watching her eyes widen as she scanned the first page. These are my terms for restoring normal operations. 7 simple requirements that address what I've discovered has been some rather creative accounting over the past few years. The terms were beautiful in their simplicity and brutal in their completeness. First, Clarraine resigns from all positions at Clarigen Technologies, effective immediately. Second, Victor Langford is permanently banned from any involvement with the company, its subsidiaries, or its business partners. Third, I resume my rightful position as Chief Executive Officer with complete operational control. Fourth, implementation of a $157 million repayment plan to recover funds that had been, let's call them, misallocated over the years. Fifth, a public statement acknowledging the true ownership structure and my role as founder and majority shareholder. Sixth, immediate termination of all lifestyle privileges funded through corporate accounts. And seventh, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would make sure this little family drama stayed out of the tabloids. She has 24 hours to review and sign. I continued, watching Elisa's face cycle through about 15 different expressions as she processed each clause. After that, we moved from the friendly resolution phase to the let the lawyers sort it out phase, which tends to be considerably more expensive for everyone involved. I'd already put my team in motion while waiting for this conversation. A.O. Mensah, my lawyer, had been reviewing corporate bylaws since midnight, building the legal framework for what was about to become the most thorough hostile takeover in recent memory. Except this time, the hostile party was the actual owner. Riya Patel, head of security, was conducting a full audit of financial irregularities that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Between the two of them, I had enough ammunition to turn this whole situation into a legal nightmare for anyone stupid enough to fight me. But I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. Despite everything that had happened tonight, despite the humiliation and the betrayal and the sheer audacity of thinking they could steal my company while I watched, I still wanted this to end with signatures on paper instead of subpoenas and depositions. Elisa clutched the envelope like it contained live explosives, which in a way, it did. What should I tell her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, and for the first time in hours, it felt genuine. Tell her the system isn't broken, Elisa. Tell her it's working exactly as designed. There's something almost poetic about watching someone's world collapse at the exact moment they thought they were winning. Like watching a house of cards fall in slow motion, each level taking the next one down until nothing's left but scattered pieces and the echo of what used to be impressive. 22 hours after I'd handed Elisa my terms, I was standing at my penthouse door listening to the sound of Clarraine Monroe. Soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Monroe, having what could generously be called a complete mental breakdown. The banging on my door didn't sound like knocking so much as drowning. You know, that desperate, rhythmless pounding that comes from someone who's run out of options and is now operating on pure panic? That was Clarraine at 11:47 p.m., hammering on my door like she was trying to wake the dead or summon the financial gods to reverse the last 24 hours of her life. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing in my hallway. This wasn't the polished, camera-ready CEO who'd been posing for magazine covers and giving keynote speeches about female leadership in tech. This was someone who looked like she'd been wrestling with reality and losing badly. Her usually perfect hair was a mess, sticking up at angles that suggested she'd been running her hands through it for hours. The designer dress she'd worn to her engagement party was wrinkled and stained with what looked like wine or tears or possibly both. But it was her eyes that really told the story, wild, desperate, the kind of look you see in cornered animals who've just realized the trap has no exit. "You can't destroy us," she said, pushing past me into the apartment without invitation. Her voice had that particular quality that comes from somewhere between rage and complete desperation, like she was trying to sound commanding but couldn't quite pull it off when her entire world was crumbling around her Louboutin heels. There is no us, I replied, closing the door with the same calm I'd used to end any other business transaction. There hasn't been an us for quite some time, apparently. There's me, there's you, and there's the company I built that you've been treating like your personal piggy bank. She whirled around to face me, and for a moment I thought she might actually take a swing. But Clarraine had always been more about psychological warfare than physical confrontation, probably because assault charges would have looked bad in the tech magazines that loved to feature her as a power woman breaking barriers in Silicon Valley. This whole thing is insane, she continued, starting to pace around my living room like a caged tiger. You're acting like some kind of a vindictive child having a tantrum because you didn't like my birthday surprise. Birthday surprise. That was what she was calling it now. Like staging a public proposal from another man at what was supposed to be my 40th birthday celebration was some kind of innocent prank instead of the most humiliating betrayal I could imagine. The woman had chutzpah, I'd give her that. Let me ask you something, Clarraine, I said, settling into my favorite chair and watching her wear a path in my carpet. At what point during the planning of this birthday surprise did you think I'd find it charming? Was it when you were picking out the venue, knowing I'd be standing there like an idiot while another man proposed to my wife? Or maybe when you were practicing your acceptance speech in the mirror, making sure you looked surprised enough to fool the cameras? Her pacing stopped for just a moment, and I caught a flash of something that might have been guilt before the desperation took over again. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Victor said it would be a way to show everyone how strong our relationship was. He said you'd understand, that you'd see the humor in it. Victor fucking said. The man had convinced my wife that publicly humiliating me would somehow strengthen our marriage, and she'd been dumb enough to believe it. Or maybe she'd wanted to believe it because it gave her permission to do what she'd been wanting to do anyway. So this was Victor's idea, I said, not really asking. Let me guess. He told you that real alpha males don't get threatened by a little friendly competition. That confident men would see the whole thing as entertainment. That I'd probably laugh and buy everyone a round of drinks. The look on her face told me I'd hit the bullseye. The poor woman had been played by a guy who understood exactly which buttons to push, who knew she was just insecure enough about our marriage to believe that public humiliation was some kind of relationship test. He said, she started, then trailed off, probably realizing how pathetic it was going to sound when she said it out loud. He said what, Clarraine? That this would prove I really loved you? That if I could handle watching him put a ring on your finger in front of 200 people, it would show everyone what a secure, modern marriage we had. I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to me. Or did he tell you that I'd be so desperate to prove myself that I'd start throwing even more money around? Maybe give him a bigger budget or a corner office with a better view? She collapsed onto my Italian leather sofa, the one piece of furniture we'd actually picked out together, back when we still talked about we and us and our future. Watching her break down on that couch felt like some kind of cosmic irony, like the universe had a sense of humor about these things. The tears started then, not the pretty kind you see in movies, but the ugly, mascara-running kind that comes from genuine despair. I'll sign your papers, she whispered, her voice so small I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But you have to understand, this isn't just about me. Victor, the employees, the investors, you're ending my life. No, I said, and my voice was gentler than I'd expected it to be. I'm ending the lie you've been living at my expense. There's a difference. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Victor was probably trying to figure out how to explain to his new fiancée that their entire lifestyle had just evaporated overnight. Somewhere else, Elisa was probably updating her resume and wondering how she'd explain her last job to potential employers. You burned through $157 million of company funds over the past 5 years, I continued, still looking out at the lights. Money that came from patents I filed, algorithms I wrote, investments I made with my own savings, and my grandmother's inheritance. Now you get to pay it back. That's impossible, she sobbed. I don't have that kind of money. Nobody has that kind of money. Then I guess you'll be making payments for a very long time, I replied. Consider it a learning experience. A very expensive lesson in the difference between owning something and borrowing it. They say that power is like gravity, invisible until someone falls, and then everyone suddenly remembers how it works. Sitting at the head of the Clarigen Technologies boardroom table at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, I was about to give 12 very expensive suits a crash course in basic physics. The kind of lesson that would be talked about in business schools for years, assuming any of these people still had careers left to talk about it. The boardroom itself was a monument to Cloraine's taste for dramatic excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a conference table that could double as a landing strip, and chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Everything designed to intimidate, to make visitors feel small and grateful just to be in the presence of such obvious success. Too bad none of them had bothered to ask who was actually paying for all this theatrical nonsense. The board members filed in like they were attending their own funeral, which in a way, they were. 12 faces that had spent the last few years nodding along to whatever Cloraine suggested, collecting their director fees, and enjoying the catered lunches that came with rubber-stamping decisions they didn't understand. Not one of them had bothered to ask the basic questions you'd think might occur to people supposedly overseeing a $157 million company. Questions like, who actually owns this place? Who filed the patents that generate our revenue? And why does the majority shareholder never seem to be consulted on major decisions? Janet Morrison, our CFO, looked particularly green around the gills. The woman had been signing off on expense reports and budget allocations for 3 years without apparently wondering where the money was coming from or who had the authority to approve spending that would make a Fortune 500 executive blush. Today she was about to discover that her signature had been authorizing the systematic looting of a company she didn't even understand. And then there was Cloraine, sitting at the far end of the table like Marie Antoinette waiting for the guillotine. 24 hours ago, she'd been the golden girl of Silicon Valley, the female CEO who was supposedly breaking glass ceilings and inspiring a generation of women in tech. Now she looked like someone who'd spent the night wrestling with the realization that her entire professional identity had been built on someone else's foundation. She'd tried to salvage some dignity with her appearance. Fresh makeup, professional blazer, hairstyle to within an inch of its life. But there's only so much you can do when you're about to publicly confess that your entire career has been an elaborate fiction. The woman who'd been giving interviews about female entrepreneurship and the importance of women owning their success was about to admit that she'd never owned anything except the 10% equity I'd given her as a wedding gift. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, standing at the head of the table like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. Thank you all for attending this emergency board meeting. I realize some of you are confused about why you're here, so let me clarify the situation with a few simple announcements. The silence in that room was so complete you could have heard a stock price drop. These people were used to Cloraine running meetings with her usual blend of corporate buzzwords and motivational speaking. They weren't prepared for someone who actually understood how the company worked to start explaining things in plain English. First, I continued. Effective immediately, Cloraine Monroe is resigning from her position as Chief Executive Officer and from all other positions within this organization. The collective intake of breath was audible. 12 faces turned toward Cloraine like they were expecting her to stand up and explain that this was some kind of joke, that the woman they'd been treating as their leader for the past 5 years wasn't actually about to disappear from their professional lives. Second, I am resuming my position as Chief Executive Officer and assuming the newly created role of Financial Oversight Director, with full veto power over all expenditures exceeding $5,000. Janet Morrison's face went from green to white so fast I thought she might actually faint. The woman had been approving expenses that would have funded small countries, and she was just now realizing that someone with actual authority might want to review her decision-making process. Third, Victor Langford is hereby permanently banned from any involvement with this company, its subsidiaries, partners, or associated business entities. Any existing contracts, consulting agreements, or business relationships involving Mr. Langford are terminated immediately. That got some murmurs. Half of these people probably didn't even know who Victor was, but the other half had watched him parade around like he owned the place, making decisions and spending money like he had some kind of actual authority instead of just good cheekbones, and an MBA from whatever overpriced business school had taught him to confuse confidence with competence. Now, I said, walking over to the whiteboard that Clarraine usually used for her inspirational corporate messaging. I'm sure some of you are wondering about the authority behind these decisions. Allow me to clarify the actual ownership structure of this company. I started writing numbers, big and clear so even the people in the back could see them. 90% ownership, myself. 10% ownership, Clarraine Monroe. 0% ownership, everyone else in this room, including our recently departed Mr. Langford. The math was simple, but I could see their brains struggling to process it. For years, they'd been operating under the assumption that Clarraine was the driving force behind Clarigen Technologies, that she was some kind of visionary entrepreneur who'd built this empire through sheer force of will and feminine empowerment. The idea that she'd been essentially an employee with a fancy title was apparently too much for some of them to handle. But wait, I continued, moving to the next section of the whiteboard. There's more. Let's talk about where our revenue actually comes from. I started listing patents, algorithms, and proprietary technologies, each one followed by a filing date and my signature. 23 patents in total, generating approximately $89 million in annual licensing fees. Every single one developed by me, filed by me, owned by me. The technology that made Clarigen profitable enough to fund Clarraine's lifestyle and Victor's consulting fees had been created by the guy they'd apparently forgotten was still around. And just for fun, I said, adding up the numbers with the kind of theatrical flourish Clarraine usually reserved for her TED Talks. Let's review Mrs. Monroe's contributions to the company's intellectual property portfolio over the past 5 years. I wrote a big, beautiful 0 on the whiteboard. Her contributions to our patent revenue. Another 0. Her contributions to our core algorithms. 0 again. Her personal investment in the company's initial funding. 0, 0, 0. By now, Clarraine looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor, but she'd already agreed to this part of my terms. The public acknowledgement, the confession that would set the record straight after years of letting people believe a carefully constructed fiction. She stood up slowly, pulled out a prepared statement, and began reading in the kind of flat, defeated voice usually reserved for prisoners confessing to crimes. I want to clarify for the record that my husband was always the founder, chief architect, and majority owner of Clarigen Technologies. While I have served as CEO, all core technologies, patents, and intellectual property were developed by him. The company's success is primarily due to his innovations and business acumen. The board stared at her like she'd just announced that gravity was optional and the earth was actually flat. Years of assumptions, crashing down in a single paragraph. Janet Morrison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What about her 10% equity stake? I smiled, and this time it felt genuinely warm. Collateral for her $157 million debt. You know what they say about following the money? That it always leads you somewhere interesting, usually somewhere the people spending it really don't want you to go. Well, after 24 hours of my crack team digging through Clarigen's financial records like forensic archaeologists excavating a crime scene, interesting was turning out to be the understatement of the century. What we were uncovering wasn't just creative accounting. It was a masterclass in corporate fraud that would have made Bernie Madoff take notes. My war room had been set up in the executive conference room, the one with the good coffee machine and the windows that looked out over the city like we were planning the D-Day invasion. Which, in a way, we were. Except instead of liberating Europe, we were liberating my company from the parasites who'd been treating it like their personal ATM for the better part of 5 years. Rhea Patel, my head of security, had the kind of smile that usually preceded someone's career ending in handcuffs. She'd spread vendor contracts across the table like a card shark revealing a royal flush. Except in this case, the royal flush was 2 completely fabricated shell companies that had been billing Clarigen for services that existed only in someone's imagination. So here's what we've got, Rhea said, pointing to a stack of invoices thick enough to use as a doorstop. Synergy Solutions LLC and Dynamic Business Consulting Incorporated. Both companies allegedly providing strategic advisory services and operational optimization consulting. Both companies billing us approximately $30,000 per month for the past 3 years. Let me guess, I said, already knowing where this was going. Neither company actually exists. Oh, they exist, Rhea replied, and her grin got even wider. They're both registered to P.O. boxes in Delaware. The incorporation papers list Victor Langford as the sole proprietor of Synergy Solutions. And guess who owns Dynamic Business Consulting? She slid another document across the table, and there it was in black and white. Clarraine Monroe, listed as the founder and CEO of a consulting company that had been billing my actual company for imaginary work. The woman had literally been paying herself a salary to consult for the company she was supposedly already running. It was like finding out your employee had been clocking in twice for the same job, except instead of overtime pay, we were talking about nearly $2 million in fraudulent billing. Anoja Bello, my forensic accountant, looked like a kid on Christmas morning who'd just discovered that Santa had left him a pile of financial irregularities under the tree. The man lived for this kind of detective work, turning corporate malfeasance into spreadsheets and turning spreadsheets into criminal evidence. He'd been hunched over his laptop for 16 hours straight, mapping out what he was calling the most elegant theft I've ever seen. The beauty of their system, Anoja explained, pulling up a flowchart that looked like something from a John Le Carre novel, is that it's technically legal. Barely legal, but legal. They set up legitimate consulting companies, filed the proper paperwork, even paid taxes on the income. The problem is that the services they were billing for were either never performed or were already part of their regular job duties. He clicked through to another screen, showing a timeline that stretched back 48 months. See, Victor would submit a proposal for strategic market analysis through Synergy Solutions. Clarraine would approve it as CEO. Then Dynamic Business Consulting would bill for implementation oversight of the same project. It's like paying two different companies to watch each other work, except both companies were owned by the same people who were approving the contracts. Luis Herrera, our HR director, had been conducting what he diplomatically called informal interviews with staff members, which was corporate speak for finding out who knew what and when they knew it. Luis had the kind of face that made people want to confess things, probably because he looked like everyone's favorite uncle, the one who'd keep your secrets but also make sure you learn from your mistakes. Most of the staff had no idea, Luis reported, flipping through a notebook filled with what looked like the testimonies of witnesses at a very white-collar crime scene. But a few of the senior people mentioned feeling uncomfortable about some of the consulting contracts. Sarah in accounting said she'd questioned several invoices, but was told by Clarraine that these were board-approved strategic initiatives that were above her pay grade to understand. Translation, I said. They were using corporate hierarchy to shut down anyone who asked awkward questions about where the money was going. Exactly. And here's the kicker. Luis flipped to another page. 3 different employees mentioned seeing Victor and Clarraine working on proposals together, but when the invoices came through, they were always from his consulting company for work he was supposedly doing independently. But the real smoking gun came from Ria's deep dive into the corporate email system. She'd found what she was calling the conspiracy thread, a series of emails that had been buried so deep in subfolders that it took specialized software to excavate them. The subject line alone was enough to make my blood boil. Birthday surprise. Optics plus leverage. This is where it gets really ugly, Ria said, pulling up the email chain on the main screen. The thread starts 6 months ago, between Clarraine, Victor, and someone named Harper North, who appears to be some kind of PR consultant specializing in what she calls viral corporate events. The first email was from Clarraine. V. Talk to Harper about your idea. She thinks a public proposal could generate significant media buzz for both of us. Could position me as the successful woman who chose love over a stagnant marriage. Thoughts? Victor's response was even worse. See, Harper's right about the optics. Your husband's been invisible in the company narrative for too long. Public proposal shows you're the one with real options, real power. Makes you look like the prize everyone wants. Plus, the humiliation factor should motivate him to prove himself financially. Win-win. They engineered the whole thing, I said, reading through emails that laid out the plan in excruciating detail. The venue, the timing, even the crowd's reaction. They choreographed my public humiliation like it was a fucking Broadway show. Harper North's contributions were the most professional and somehow the most disgusting. She'd treated my marriage like a marketing campaign, complete with target demographics and expected social media engagement. The key, she'd written in one email, is making sure the husband looks like the obvious loser in the scenario. Older, less charismatic, clearly out of his league. The contrast will make Victor look even more alpha and Clarraine look even more desirable. There were spreadsheets projecting media coverage, mock-ups of social media posts, even a timeline for follow-up interviews where Clarraine would talk about finding the courage to choose happiness, and Victor would discuss what real leadership looks like in modern relationships. They'd turn my 40th birthday into a corporate strategy session, my marriage into a publicity stunt, and my humiliation into a carefully calculated business decision designed to increase their personal brands while positioning me as the pathetic loser who couldn't hold onto his successful wife. Forward everything to AO, I said, feeling a cold anger settle into my chest like ice water. Every email, every contract, every fraudulent invoice. This just stopped being about money. Ria's smile turned predatory. Already done. Your lawyer says this moves us from hostile takeover territory into criminal conspiracy territory. Good, I replied, watching the city lights twinkle outside our windows like stars. Because the war just changed. There's something profoundly therapeutic about writing a check for $20 million when you're feeling like the entire corporate world has been treating you like a chump for the better part of a decade. Not because of the money itself. Though let's be honest, having enough cash to casually invest 8 figures does wonders for your sense of perspective, but because of what that check represents. It's proof that while other people were busy playing politics and staging publicity stunts, you were building something real, something valuable enough that you can afford to bet big on the future. Standing in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that smelled like sawdust and possibility, I was about to do exactly that. Brightlayer AI occupied the kind of space that real entrepreneurs use when they're more interested in changing the world than impressing investors with marble lobbies and Italian leather furniture. Exposed brick walls, concrete floors, mismatched desks that looked like they'd been assembled from whatever was on sale at IKEA, and the kind of nervous energy that only comes from brilliant people working on problems that keep them awake at night. Layla Chun was 27 years old, and had the kind of focused intensity that reminded me of myself 20 years ago, back when I thought the biggest obstacle to success was finding enough hours in the day to write code. She'd built an emotion recognition AI system that could analyze micro-expressions and vocal patterns with an accuracy that made IBM's Watson look like a magic 8-ball. But she'd hit the wall that kills more startups than bad ideas and market crashes combined: training data. The problem isn't the algorithm, she explained, gesturing toward a whiteboard covered in equations that would make a MIT professor weep with joy. We can recognize emotional states with 94% accuracy when we have sufficient training data. But getting that data legally and ethically? That's where everything breaks down. She was pacing around the warehouse like a caged tiger, running her hands through hair that looked like she'd been pulling at it for weeks. The woman had clearly been surviving on coffee and determination for so long that a decent meal and 8 hours of sleep would probably kill her from the shock. Facebook has billions of tagged photos. Google has decades of search data. Amazon has every purchase decision anyone's ever made. But if you're a startup trying to build something that actually helps people instead of manipulating them into buying things they don't need, you're screwed. The data oligopoly makes sure of that. I understood her frustration better than she knew. The same problem had nearly killed Clarigen in its early days, back when I was spending 18-hour days trying to figure out how to compete with companies that had resources I couldn't even dream of. The difference was that I'd eventually found a way around the problem through pure stubborn persistence and more luck than any sane person should count on. Layla was just as smart as I'd been, probably smarter, but she was hitting the same wall at a time when the big tech companies had made that wall even higher. What if I told you? I said, pulling out my checkbook with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from having survived your own corporate apocalypse. That training data doesn't have to be your problem anymore. Her pacing stopped so abruptly, I thought she might have actually frozen mid-step. I'm sorry, what? $20 million. I continued, writing out the amount in my neat, careful handwriting. 40% equity, board seat, and enough funding to acquire all the training data you need through legitimate partnerships instead of trying to scrape together free samples. I tore off the check and held it out to her, watching her face cycle through about 15 different expressions as she processed what was happening. This was the moment that separated real entrepreneurs from people who just talked about changing the world. Some people would hesitate, worry about giving up control, spend weeks negotiating terms, and trying to squeeze every advantage out of the deal. Real entrepreneurs recognize opportunity when it's standing in front of them holding a check. Layla grabbed the check like it might evaporate if she didn't move fast enough. Are you serious right now? Because if this is some kind of joke, it's a really expensive way to mess with someone's head. Dead serious, I replied. I've spent the last week watching a company I built get looted by people who couldn't code their way out of a paper bag if you gave them the source code and a team of consultants. Being around people who actually understand technology, who care more about solving problems than posing for magazine covers. This feels like coming home. And it did. For the first time in years, I was in a room full of people who got excited about algorithms instead of stock options, who measured success in problem-solving rather than press coverage. These were my people, the ones who stayed up until 3 in the morning not because they had to, but because they'd just figured out how to make something work better. Dr. Otis Morgan, the CTO of Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, had been waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. Emergency room triage was still largely guesswork disguised as medical expertise, with overworked doctors trying to assess patient urgency based on incomplete information and gut instinct. BrightLayer's emotion recognition AI could analyze facial expressions, vocal stress patterns, and behavioral indicators to help medical staff identify patients who were in serious distress but unable to articulate their symptoms effectively. We're talking about saving lives, Dr. Morgan explained during our impromptu partnership meeting. People have heart attacks and strokes in our waiting room because they don't look sick enough to get immediate attention. Your system could flag those cases before they become tragedies. The pilot program we outlined would put BrightLayer's AI into 3 emergency departments across Brooklyn, analyzing patient interactions in real time and alerting medical staff when someone showed signs of severe distress that weren't obvious to human observation. It was exactly the kind of meaningful application that made all the technical challenges worth solving. Jules Tanaka, one of Layla's developers, exemplified everything I'd been missing at Clarigen. The kid was maybe 24 years old, so shy that making eye contact seemed physically painful for him. But when he sat down at his computer at 3 in the morning to fix a critical bug in the emotion mapping algorithm, magic happened. Not the corporate magic of good PR and strategic partnerships, but real magic. The kind where broken code becomes elegant solutions and theoretical problems become practical applications. Watching Jules' work reminded me why I'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. There's something pure about good code, something honest that you can't fake or spin or market your way around. Either the algorithm works or it doesn't. Either the system solves the problem or it fails. No amount of charisma or corporate buzzwords can make bad code perform better, and no amount of politics can make an elegant solution less beautiful. As I was leaving the warehouse, feeling more energized than I had in months, my phone buzzed with a text from Clarigen. Just 2 words, draft ready. Time to finish what we'd started. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone try to spin their way out of the truth, especially when you're the one holding all the facts and they're holding nothing but a handful of corporate buzzwords and wishful thinking. Sitting across from Clarigen at Café Solstice, a deliberately unremarkable coffee shop in Midtown that wouldn't attract paparazzi or tech bloggers looking for their next viral moment, I was about to witness the final death throes of a public relations strategy that had been doomed from the moment someone decided to turn my birthday party into a reality TV show. The cafe was exactly what I'd wanted for this conversation. Anonymous, quiet, and completely devoid of the kind of theatrical backdrop that Clarigen usually preferred for her public appearances. No marble countertops, no dramatic lighting, no strategically placed logo displays. Just worn wooden tables, the smell of decent coffee, and the kind of background noise that would make it impossible for anyone to accidentally record our conversation for later use on social media. Clarigen looked like she'd been styling herself for a hostage video. Gone were the power suits and carefully coordinated accessories that had been her trademark during the glory days of playing CEO. Instead, she'd opted for what I could only describe as contrite casual, a simple gray sweater, minimal makeup, and the kind of understated jewelry that was supposed to suggest humility and personal growth. Even her posture was different, less commanding and more apologetic, like she'd been practicing how to look appropriately sorry for cameras that weren't there. She slid a manila folder across the table with the careful precision of someone handling a live grenade. "The draft statement," she said, her voice carrying the flat, defeated tone of someone who'd finally run out of ways to avoid reality. "Harper North worked on the messaging for 3 days. She says this should minimize the damage to both our reputations." Harper North, the PR consultant who'd helped orchestrate my public humiliation, was now trying to manage the fallout from her own brilliant strategy. The woman who'd treated my marriage like a marketing campaign was apparently still on the payroll, still trying to find ways to spin disaster into opportunity. I opened the folder and started reading what could generously be called a masterpiece of corporate non-apology. The statement was everything I'd expected from someone who made a living turning lies into press releases. Carefully worded, strategically vague, and designed to acknowledge wrongdoing without actually admitting to anything that might be useful in a courtroom. "It has come to our attention that there have been some misunderstandings about the ownership and operational structure of Clarigen Technologies," the draft began. Misunderstandings, like the systematic theft of $157 million and the staging of my public humiliation, were just innocent communications failures that could be cleared up with better corporate messaging. "While Clarraine Monroe has served effectively as chief executive officer, we want to clarify that the company's technical innovations and founding vision originated primarily with her business partner. Business partner, not husband, not majority owner, not the guy who'd spent 20 years building the company while she spent 20 years spending the profits." The whole thing continued in the same vein for 3 pages, acknowledging facts while avoiding responsibility, confirming details while deflecting blame. It was the kind of statement that would let everyone save face while ensuring that nobody actually learned anything useful from the experience. Corporate PR at its most cynical and least effective. I looked up from the draft to find Clarraine watching me with the desperate hope of someone waiting to hear that their cancer was benign. "What do you think?" she asked, and I could hear years of media training in the way she tried to make the question sound casual instead of life or death important. "I think," I said, pulling out a red pen with the deliberate ceremony of a professor grading a failing exam, "that Harper North doesn't understand the difference between damage control and truth-telling." I started rewriting the statement line by line, crossing out the euphemisms and replacing them with facts. Where the draft said misunderstandings, I wrote deliberate misrepresentation. Where it mentioned business partner, I wrote majority owner and founder. Where Harper had crafted careful non-apologies, I inserted specific admissions of responsibility. "You can't publish that," Clarraine said, watching me turn her PR strategy into something that would actually inform the public instead of confusing them. "It's too harsh. People will think. People will think what exactly?" I interrupted. "That a woman who spent 5 years pretending to have built a company she didn't create, using money she didn't earn, while planning to humiliate her husband for social media content, might not be the inspiring feminist entrepreneur she pretended to be." I kept writing, and with each correction, I watched Clarraine's face go through the same emotional progression I'd seen from her during our midnight conversation. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, reluctant acceptance that the truth was going to come out whether she liked it or not. The final version was everything the original wasn't: clear, specific, and honest. It acknowledged my role as founder and majority owner. It admitted that Clarraine's position had been largely ceremonial. It confirmed that all major innovations and patents had been developed by me. Most importantly, it took responsibility for the financial irregularities and public deception without trying to spin them as innocent mistakes. "Sign it," I said, sliding the revised statement back across the table. She read through it twice, wincing at every factual correction, every honest admission, every sentence that would make it impossible for her to continue the fiction she'd been living. But she signed it anyway, because the alternative was watching me release the email evidence and the financial records that would make this public confession look generous by comparison. At exactly 8 means transparency o'clock the next morning, the statement went live on Clarigen's website, my personal LinkedIn profile, and every tech news platform that had ever featured Clarraine as an example of female leadership in Silicon Valley. By 9 o'clock, it was trending on Twitter. By 10, Tech bloggers were calling it the most honest corporate confession they'd ever seen. By noon, major business publications were reaching out for follow-up interviews. The tech press, starved for authenticity in an industry built on hype and performance, embraced the statement like it was water in the desert. Finally, a tech executive who tells the truth, wrote TechCrunch. The real story behind Silicon Valley's golden couple, proclaimed Wired. When transparency actually, headlined Forbes. Cloraine's social media went silent. Victor disappeared from public view entirely. The lifestyle bloggers who'd been covering their engagement as some kind of fairy tale romance quietly deleted their posts and moved on to less controversial topics. But the most satisfying response came from Dr. Morgan at Brooklyn Methodist, who called me personally to say that the statement had convinced his board to fast-track our Bright Layer pilot program. When someone's willing to tell the truth about their failures, he said, it makes me trust them with our successes. That evening, I finally dealt with the birthday gift that had started this whole mess. The diamond necklace, still wrapped in its Tiffany box, went to a scholarship auction in my grandmother's name. Let someone else's love story benefit from the ruins of mine. You know what's funny about downsizing your life? Everyone expects you to feel diminished, like trading a penthouse for a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side should come with some kind of existential crisis and a midlife sports car to compensate. But standing in my new living room with its normal-sized windows and furniture that didn't require a small loan to afford, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Sometimes getting smaller is actually about getting real, and getting real turns out to be a hell of a lot more comfortable than living in a museum dedicated to other people's ideas of success. The apartment was everything the penthouse wasn't: lived in, practical, and completely free of any pretentious bullshit. No marble countertops that cost more than most people's cars. No Italian leather furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. No crystal chandeliers that required their own insurance policy. Just normal stuff. A couch you could actually sit on without worrying about designer fabric. Windows you could open without triggering some kind of climate control system. And a kitchen where you could make coffee without feeling like you were performing surgery in a sterile operating room. The best part was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of a place so expensive that even the air felt intimidating, but the comfortable silence of a space where you could think without wondering who was watching or what impression you were supposed to be making. For the first time in a decade, I could walk around my own home without feeling like I was visiting someone else's idea of what my life should look like. 3 days a week, I was teaching at Columbia. Introduction to Algorithmic Thinking and Advanced Data Structures. The university had been thrilled to get someone with my background, especially after the public statement had established my actual credentials instead of letting people assume I was just some kind of silent partner in my wife's success story. There's something deeply satisfying about working with students who are hungry to learn instead of employees who are just trying to figure out how to game the system for their next promotion. My students were the kind of people I'd forgotten existed in the corporate world: brilliant, curious, and more interested in solving interesting problems than in networking their way into corner offices. They asked the kind of questions that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with programming in the first place, back when code was about elegance and efficiency instead of quarterly earnings and market positioning. Professor Monroe, one of them, had asked after class, "How do you know when an algorithm is actually good versus just commercially viable?" It was the kind of question that would never occur to someone like Victor, who measured the value of technology by how much money it could generate in the shortest possible time. But it was exactly the kind of question that mattered if you actually cared about building things that worked instead of things that sold. BrightLayer was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with stock prices or press coverage and everything to do with solving problems that mattered. Dr. Morgan's pilot program had been so successful that 3 more hospitals had signed on, and Jules had developed an enhancement that could predict panic attacks with 87% accuracy, giving emergency room staff crucial early warning when patients were about to have psychological crises that could complicate their medical treatment. Layla had grown into the kind of CEO I'd wanted to be 20 years ago: focused, principled, and completely uninterested in the performative aspects of leadership that had consumed so much of Cloraine's energy. She measured success in lives improved rather than magazine covers, and her team responded with the kind of dedication that only comes from believing in what you're building. The free templates I'd started offering to startup founders were getting more downloads than I'd expected. Turns out there were a lot of people who wanted to build something real, but didn't know how to protect themselves from the kind of corporate parasites that had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for. Legal frameworks for majority ownership, financial controls to prevent unauthorized spending, and partnership agreements that actually protected the people doing the work. Basic stuff that business schools apparently didn't teach, but that could save entrepreneurs from learning expensive lessons the hard way. Clarraine had relocated to Portland, where she was teaching coding to kids at a nonprofit that specialized in getting underprivileged students interested in technology. The handwritten apology she'd sent me was surprisingly honest, free of the corporate speak and strategic messaging that had characterized our relationship for so many years. I lost myself in the performance, she'd written. I forgot that being successful and looking successful aren't the same thing. I'm sorry for the hurt I caused and the trust one broke. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. I'd filed the letter away in my desk drawer, not because I was holding on to grudges, but because forgiveness and forgetting aren't the same thing either. The letter represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next, but it didn't erase the years of deception or the deliberate cruelty of that birthday party. Some things you move past without moving back to where you started. Victor had discovered that being an alpha male was considerably less impressive when you didn't have someone else's company to run or someone else's money to spend. The investor community had turned on him with the kind of swift, brutal efficiency that Silicon Valley reserved for people who'd been exposed as frauds. His consulting business had collapsed, his social media had gone quiet, and according to the gossip that occasionally filtered back through mutual acquaintances, he was working for a mid-tier marketing firm in New Jersey, spending his days creating PowerPoint presentations for companies that sold accounting software to dental practices. But the most unexpected development was Elisa. Clarraine's former assistant had joined BrightLayer as operations manager, and she turned out to have a natural talent for the kind of detailed project coordination that kept complex technical initiatives on track. Free from the toxic environment of corporate performance art, she'd blossomed into someone who could manage multiple hospital partnerships while keeping a team of brilliant but scattered engineers focused on deliverables and deadlines. You seem different, Carlos Alvarez, my new building's doorman, had mentioned the previous week. Lighter somehow, like you're not carrying around something heavy anymore. He was right, though I wasn't sure I could have explained it to him in a way that would make sense. I'd spent so many years trying to support a life that wasn't really mine, funding a version of success that required constant performance and endless expense. Now I was just living, working on projects that mattered, teaching students who cared about learning, investing in companies that solved real problems instead of creating impressive-looking quarterly reports. The money was still there, more than I could spend in several lifetimes, even after the divorce settlement and the various legal fees that had come with untangling 20 years of financial complications. But it felt different now, like a tool for doing interesting work instead of a scorecard for proving my worth to people whose opinions had never actually mattered. For the first time in years, I was sleeping well. Walking through Clarigen's offices 6 months later was like visiting a museum of my own past life. The champagne fountains were gone, replaced by engineers actually solving problems. The marble lobbies had been converted into collaborative workspaces where people wrote code instead of press releases. The culture charter I'd implemented was printed on simple paper and taped to walls. We build, or we don't spend. Real work. No stunts. Finally, the numbers told the story better than any corporate narrative ever could. R&D budgets restored to pre-fraud levels. 2 major patents filed in the last quarter alone. Employee satisfaction scores that actually meant something because we'd stopped paying consultants to fabricate them. Profit margins that reflected actual productivity instead of creative accounting. But the real victory wasn't happening in boardrooms or balance sheets. It was happening 60 blocks away in Brooklyn, where BrightLayer's emotion recognition AI was saving lives in emergency rooms. Dr. Morgan's latest report showed a 37% improvement in critical case identification, which translated to real people going home to their families instead of becoming statistics. Jules had developed a new module that could detect early signs of sepsis through microexpression analysis, giving doctors precious additional time to intervene before patients crashed. Layla's team was expanding to pediatric applications, helping identify children who couldn't verbalize their pain. Purpose, not performance. I'd found my park bench ritual, Central Park, every Sunday morning, phones silenced, just watching the world wake up. Joggers, dog walkers, families pushing strollers toward another ordinary day of living their actual lives instead of performing them for audiences that didn't matter. The war was over. Not because I'd destroyed my enemies, but because I'd remembered who I actually was underneath all the corporate theater. Clarraine was rebuilding her life around teaching kids to code. Victor was learning what real work felt like, and I was finally free to build things that mattered instead of funding other people's fantasies. Success, I'd realized, wasn't a room full of applause from people who'd forget your name the moment the check stopped clearing. It wasn't magazine covers or keynote speeches or diamond rings presented at other people's birthday parties. Success was code that solved real problems. Students who left class excited about algorithms. Companies that created value instead of extracting it. Sleeping well because your work mattered to people who mattered. I'd spent 20 years thinking that having everything meant owning everything. But sitting on that bench, watching Central Park fill with people living their authentic, unperformed lives, I understood the difference between winning and being free. The city stretched out in front of me, full of problems that needed solving and people smart enough to solve them. Somewhere out there, another 20-something was writing code in a coffee shop. Another startup was choosing substance over spectacle. Another entrepreneur was learning that real wealth comes from building things that last. I once thought success was a room full of applause. Now I know it's a life where no one is performing and the work still shines. That's my win. My pregnant wife banned me from the delivery room because she wanted her first love, David, to be the first to hold her first child. So I shut off funding, canceled her registry, and left her first love the bill. Well, here I am, 34 years old, and still trying to figure out how the hell I ended up in this mess. My name's Marcus Hale, and up until recently, I thought I had my shit together. I'm a carpenter by trade. Not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps my hands busy, which is more than I can say for half the guys I went to high school with who are still living in their parents' basements playing video games and complaining about the system. I built what I thought was a pretty decent life. Nothing fancy, mind you. I'm not driving around in some souped-up truck with truck nuts hanging from the back, and I don't have a man cave with 3 flat-screen TVs and a beer fridge. But I've got a solid roof over my head, a mortgage that doesn't make me want to cry into my Cheerios every morning, and enough money in the bank to take my wife out for dinner at someplace nicer than Applebee's on special occasions. Speaking of my wife, Clara. Goddamn, where do I even start with Clara? She was supposed to be my world, my everything. The woman who made me believe in all that happily ever after bullshit they sell you in movies. We'd been married for 4 years, and I genuinely thought what we had was solid as the oak cabinets I build in my workshop. You know that feeling when you think you finally got life by the balls? Yeah, that was me. Stupid, naive, completely clueless me. I worked my ass off for that woman. And I mean really worked. 12-hour days swinging hammers, measuring twice and cutting once, dealing with contractors who couldn't organize a one-man parade, let alone a construction project. My back ached constantly, my hands were permanently stained with wood varnish, and I'm pretty sure I've inhaled enough sawdust to build a small shed in my lungs. But I did it all because I thought we were building something together, you know? A life, a future, all that sappy romantic crap that makes single guys roll their eyes and married guys nod knowingly. The kicker? I turned down better offers. Real money too. Jobs in other cities, opportunities that could have set us up for life. But no, Marcus the Magnificent decides to stay put because heaven forbid we uproot our precious little life. We're building something here, Clara. I'd say, like some kind of wisdom-spouting philosopher who'd figured out the secret to domestic bliss. Why chase money when we've got everything we need right here? Christ, I should have charged admission for people to come watch me be that delusional. My buddy Leo, who runs the hardware store where I buy most of my supplies, used to give me endless shit about how devoted I was. Marcus, he'd say while ringing up my latest purchase of screws and sandpaper, you're married to Clara more than you are to yourself, man. When's the last time you did something just for you? And I'd laugh it off, make some joke about how marriage is about compromise and partnership, all while secretly feeling pretty damn proud of myself for being such a dedicated husband. Leo wasn't wrong, though. Looking back now, and trust me, hindsight is a real son of a bitch. I can see that I'd completely lost myself in being Clara's husband. I stopped hanging out with my friends as much, stopped working on personal projects. Hell, I even gave up my Sunday morning fishing trips because Clara said she felt abandoned when I was gone for a few hours. I should have seen that red flag waving so hard it could have powered a small wind farm. But instead, I interpreted it as her wanting to spend more time with me. Because I'm an idiot. A well-meaning, hard-working, completely oblivious idiot. The funny thing is, I actually enjoyed being that guy. You know, the devoted husband, the reliable provider, the man who always put his wife first. It felt good to be needed, to be the solid rock in someone else's life. When Clara would curl up next to me on the couch after a long day, or when she'd bring me a sandwich while I was working in the garage, or when she'd tell her friends how lucky she was to have me. Man, those moments made all the long hours and aching muscles worth it. I thought I was living the dream. The American dream, even. Work hard, love your wife, build a life together, and everything else will fall into place. I remember this one evening, must have been about 6 months before everything went to hell, when Clara and I were sitting on our back porch watching the sun set over our neighbor's half-dead vegetable garden. She had her feet propped up on my lap, and I was rubbing them because she'd had a long day at her office job. Something in marketing that I never fully understood but nodded along with whenever she talked about it. You know what I love about us? She said. And I'm thinking here it comes. One of those mushy romantic moments that'll make me feel like I'm starring in my own personal rom-com. We just fit together. Like we were made for each other. And I believed it. God help me, I believed every word. I squeezed her foot and said something equally cheesy back, probably about how she completed me or some other Jerry Maguire nonsense. But in that moment, sitting there with my wife, in the house I'd helped build, surrounded by the life we'd created together, I felt like the luckiest bastard alive. That's the thing about being completely blindsided. You never see it coming because you're too busy congratulating yourself on how well everything's going. I was so focused on being the perfect husband that I missed all the signs that my perfect wife wasn't nearly as invested in our perfect life as I thought she was. But we'll get to that train wreck soon enough. For now, just picture me. Marcus Hale, 34-year-old carpenter, devoted husband, future father, and grade-A sucker who thought he had life all figured out. Spoiler alert, I didn't have jack shit figured out. Holy shit, I'm gonna be a dad. That was literally the first thought that went through my brain when Clara dropped the bombshell on me. Not, oh wow, what wonderful news, or I'm so excited to start this journey with you, my beloved wife. Nope. Just a good old-fashioned American holy shit, followed by the kind of ugly crying you usually only see at funerals or when your team loses the Super Bowl in overtime. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and I'd just gotten home from installing kitchen cabinets at some rich lady's McMansion where she'd changed her mind about the hardware 3 times and acted like I was personally responsible for ruining her entire aesthetic vision. I was dirty, tired, and looking forward to nothing more than a beer, a sandwich, and maybe catching the end of whatever game was on ESPN. But Clara had other plans. She was sitting at our kitchen table, the one I'd built myself from reclaimed barn wood because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment, with this weird look on her face. Not happy, not sad, just intense. Like she was trying to solve a really complicated math problem in her head. In front of her was this little white plastic stick that looked suspiciously like those pregnancy tests they show in movies right before someone's life gets completely turned upside down. So, she said, and her voice had this shaky quality that made my stomach drop faster than a lead balloon. Remember how I've been feeling kind of weird lately? And that's when it hit me. The morning sickness she'd been blaming on that sketchy Chinese takeout place. The weird food cravings that had me running to the grocery store at 10 p.m. looking for pickles and ice cream, like some kind of cliché pregnancy stereotype. The way she'd been falling asleep on the couch every night by 8:30, which I'd just attributed to her stressful job. I looked at that little plastic stick, then at Clara, then back at the stick, and felt something inside me just completely break open. Not break like something was damaged, but break like a dam giving way to a flood of emotions I didn't even know I had. Before I knew it, I was sobbing like a little kid who'd just found out Santa was real after all. Are we? I couldn't even get the words out through the blubbering. Clara just nodded, and then she was crying too, and we were both sitting there at our kitchen table having what was probably the most emotional moment of our entire marriage over a peace stick. Romantic as hell, right? But man, once the initial shock wore off, I was all in. Like, embarrassingly, completely, over the moon all in. I went from zero to super dad faster than you could say baby on board. The next day, I showed up at Clara's office with the biggest bouquet of flowers I could find. Roses, lilies, baby's breath, the whole 9 yards. Cost me almost $50, which might not sound like much to some people. But when you're living on a carpenter's salary and trying to save for a baby, $50 is a real commitment. Her coworkers were grinning like idiots when I walked in carrying this massive floral arrangement like I was trying to apologize for cheating or something. Special occasion? Asked Janet from accounting, who'd always struck me as the kind of woman who lived vicariously through other people's relationships because her own was deader than roadkill. We're having a baby, I announced, probably loud enough for the entire office to hear. And I swear to God, I felt like I was going to burst with pride. Like I'd just won the lottery, climbed Mount Everest, and solved world hunger all at the same time. That was just the beginning of my transformation into what my sister Rachel would later describe as the most annoyingly devoted expectant father in the history of mankind. Every week, like clockwork, I'd show up with flowers. Not the cheap gas station bouquets either. I'm talking about the good stuff from the actual florist who charged me an arm and a leg, but made arrangements that looked like they belonged in a magazine. When the morning sickness hit Clara hard around week 6, I turned into Gordon Ramsay meets Mr. Rogers. I'd wake up early every morning to make her ginger tea and toast cut into little triangles, because she said the crusts made her nauseous. I'd pack her crackers and ginger ale for work, leave little encouraging notes in her lunch bag, and rush home during my lunch break to check on her if she was having a particularly rough day. The real masterpiece, though, was the rocking chair. I spent 3 weeks in my garage after work, carefully selecting the perfect piece of oak, measuring and cutting each piece by hand, sanding until my arms felt like jelly. I wanted it to be perfect, not just functional, but beautiful. Something Clara could nurse our baby in, something that would last for generations. I even carved our initials and the date into the back, along with a little heart. Yeah, I know how that sounds. I was basically a Hallmark card come to life. My sister Rachel, bless her sarcastic heart, gave me endless shit about my newfound obsession with all things baby-related. She lived about 20 minutes away and had made it her personal mission to keep me grounded in reality, which apparently meant mocking me mercilessly every chance she got. "Marcus," she said one day when she caught me reading, "what to expect when you're expecting for the 3rd time. You do realize that the baby isn't even the size of a grape yet, right? You're acting like Clara's about to give birth tomorrow." But I didn't care. I was going to be a dad, and I was going to be the best damn dad that ever existed. I read every baby book I could get my hands on. I'm talking about everything from the basic baby care 101 stuff to the more advanced parenting philosophy books that made my brain hurt, but convinced me I needed to understand the psychological implications of different lullabies. During those evening reading sessions, Clara would curl up next to me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, and I'd read passages out loud while rubbing her still flat belly. "Listen to this," I'd say. "It says here that babies can hear sounds from outside the womb starting around 20 weeks. We should start playing classical music." And Clara would laugh, that genuine, happy laugh that made me fall in love with her all over again, and say something like, "Marcus, you're going to be such an amazing dad." Those were the moments I thought would last forever. Me, Clara, our unborn baby, and all the time in the world to build the perfect family. I'd whisper promises to her belly about how I'd never abandon them, how I'd always be there, how our kid would never have to wonder if daddy loved them. I meant every single word. Looking back now, those might have been the happiest few months of my entire life. I was building a family, creating something real and lasting and beautiful. Or at least, that's what I thought I was doing. You know that feeling when you're walking down the street, minding your own business, feeling pretty good about life, and then you step in a massive pile of dog shit? Yeah, that's basically what it felt like when David Cross waltzed back into our lives like he owned the place. Except this particular pile of dog shit had perfect abs, a winning smile, and apparently the supernatural ability to make my pregnant wife forget she had a husband. It started innocently enough, Or at least that's what I kept telling myself while my gut was screaming that something was seriously wrong. Clara came home from her doctor's appointment one afternoon. This was around month 4 of the pregnancy, right when she was starting to show, and I was getting all kinds of excited about finally having a visible baby bump to talk to. And she had this weird energy about her. Not bad weird, but different weird. Like she'd just run into an old friend at the grocery store and spent 20 minutes catching up in the cereal aisle. "You'll never guess who I saw today," she said, setting her purse down on the kitchen counter with just a little too much casualness. "You know that fake casual thing people do when they're about to drop news they know you're not going to love?" That was Clara in that moment. "Who?" I asked, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment and have never learned to recognize when ignorance might actually be bliss. "David Cross." And there it was. The name I hadn't heard in years, but somehow knew was going to fuck up my life the moment it came out of her mouth. David fucking Cross. Clara's high school sweetheart. Her first love. The guy she used to go on and on about during our early dating days, until I finally had to tell her that hearing about her ex-boyfriend's romantic gestures wasn't exactly making me feel like hot shit. Now, I'm not usually the jealous type. I mean, we all have exes, right? We all have that person from our past who meant something at some point. But David wasn't just any ex. This was the guy Clara had described as her first and only love back when we were dating, before she decided I was worth settling down with. The guy she'd lost her virginity to. The guy who'd apparently set the gold standard for romance that I'd been unknowingly competing against for years. "Oh yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice level while my brain started doing that thing where it spirals into worst-case scenarios faster than a tornado in Kansas. "How's he doing?" "Good, actually. Really good. He looks—" She paused, and I swear to God I could see her searching for a word that wouldn't make me want to put my fist through the drywall I'd installed myself. "He looks really healthy. He's been working as a fitness trainer since his second divorce." Second divorce. Let me just pause here for a moment to appreciate the irony. This guy, this supposed paragon of masculine perfection who'd set the bar so impossibly high for every other man in Clara's life, had already crashed and burned through 2 marriages. But somehow, in Clara's eyes, he was still the golden boy who got away. According to Clara's breathless recap of their chance encounter at the doctor's office, what were the odds, right? David had been there visiting his sister who worked as a nurse. He'd been gone for years, living in different cities, trying to make it work with wife number 1, then wife number 2. And now he was back in our sleepy little town, working at some fancy fitness center where desperate housewives paid premium prices to have a good-looking guy tell them how to use a treadmill. "He asked about us," Clara continued, and I noticed she was fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I told him about the baby. He seemed really happy for us." Happy for us. Right. Because nothing says, "I'm genuinely happy for my ex-girlfriend's success," like showing up in her life right when she's at her most vulnerable and hormonal. I'm sure his timing was purely coincidental. "That's nice," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? "Hey honey, I'd prefer if you didn't talk to the guy you used to be madly in love with while you're carrying our child." That would make me sound like a controlling asshole, and the last thing I wanted was to give Clara any reason to think David was the more reasonable option. But here's the thing. Over the next few weeks, David's name started popping up in conversation with alarming frequency. David mentioned this great prenatal yoga class. David said his sister recommended this birthing center. David thinks we should consider a water birth. David, fucking David. It was like the guy had appointed himself as our unofficial pregnancy consultant, and Clara was eating it up. Then came the texts. Oh, the goddamn texts. Clara had always been pretty open with her phone around me. We weren't one of those couples who hid our devices or acted all secretive about our communications. But suddenly, her phone was face down on the table during dinner. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it, and then quickly flip it over with this little smile that made my stomach twist into knots. "Who's texting?" I asked one night when her phone lit up for the 3rd time during our meal. "Just David," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "He's checking in on how I'm feeling. Isn't that sweet?" Sweet. Sure. Because nothing says appropriate boundaries like a recently divorced fitness trainer texting another man's pregnant wife to check in on her feelings. I'm sure his motivations were purely platonic and had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that pregnant women are often feeling vulnerable and unappreciated. The late-night texting was what really got to me. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom, and there would be Clara, sitting up in bed with her phone glowing in the darkness, typing away with a concentration that she usually reserved for important work emails. When she noticed I was awake, she'd quickly put the phone away and snuggle up to me like nothing had happened. Couldn't sleep? I'd ask. Just restless, she'd say. The baby's been kicking. But I knew the truth. David was keeping my wife awake at night, and she was letting him. My sister Rachel, who has the subtlety of a brick through a window and the intuition of a damn psychic, picked up on the situation immediately when I mentioned David's miraculous reappearance during one of our weekly coffee meetups. "Marcus," she said, stirring her latte with the kind of aggressive intensity that meant she was about to drop some truth bombs. "Don't let history rewrite itself in your own house. That's exactly what this asshole is trying to do." But I brushed it off, because I'm an optimist and an idiot, and because I wanted to believe that the woman I'd married, the woman who was carrying my child, wouldn't be stupid enough to jeopardize everything we'd built for some nostalgic bullshit with her high school boyfriend. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. I should have trusted Rachel. Hell, I should have trusted the obvious red flags that were waving so hard they could have generated their own weather system. But instead, I chose to trust Clara. And that, as they say, was my first mistake. If there's one thing I can say about myself, it's that when I commit to something, I go all fucking in. And preparing for our baby? Man, I went in harder than a linebacker chasing a fumble. I'm talking about full scale, no expense spared. This kid is gonna have everything they could possibly need level of commitment. Looking back now, I realize I was probably overcompensating for the growing distance I could feel between Clara and me, but at the time, I convinced myself I was just being a good provider. A great husband. Father of the fucking year before the kid was even born. The nursery became my obsession. Not just any nursery, mind you, but the kind of baby paradise that would make Pinterest moms weep with envy. I spent weeks researching cribs, reading reviews, comparing safety ratings, and driving Clara absolutely insane with my questions about themes and color schemes. Did she want safari animals? Classic teddy bears? Something gender-neutral with yellows and greens? I was like a man possessed, armed with measuring tape and baby gear catalogs. "Marcus," Clara said one evening when she found me hunched over my laptop at midnight, scrolling through baby furniture websites like I was studying for the damn bar exam. "It's just a crib. Pick one." Just a crib? Just a crib? This was our child's first bed, the place where they'd sleep for the first few years of their life, where they'd dream their first dreams, and hopefully not have nightmares about their father's questionable decorating choices. There was nothing just about it. I ended up going with this convertible crib that cost more than my first car, solid hardwood construction, non-toxic finishes, and the ability to transform into a toddler bed and eventually a full-size bed. "It's an investment," I explained to Clara when she saw the price tag and nearly choked on her prenatal vitamins. "This crib will last until they go to college." But the crib was just the beginning. Oh no, I was just getting warmed up. Next came the stroller, and let me tell you, the world of baby transportation devices is more complicated than NASA's mission planning. There are jogger strollers, travel systems, lightweight umbrella strollers, and high-end European models that cost more than some people's rent. I read every review, watched every YouTube comparison video, and probably drove the sales staff at Babies R Us to the brink of a nervous breakdown with my endless questions. I settled on this deluxe travel system that looked like it could survive a zombie apocalypse while providing maximum comfort for our precious cargo. It had all-terrain wheels, a 5-point harness system, and enough cup holders and storage compartments to make a soccer mom weep with joy. When I wheeled it out of the store, I felt like I'd just purchased a luxury SUV for someone who couldn't even hold their own head up yet. Then there was the car seat situation, which turned me into a full-blown safety inspector. I spent an entire Saturday at the fire department getting trained on proper installation techniques, because apparently, like 80% of car seats are installed incorrectly, and I'd be damned if my kid was going to be in that statistic. The firefighter who helped me, a patient guy named Steve who probably dealt with neurotic first-time dads on a regular basis, must have shown me the proper angle and tension 20 times before I was satisfied. "You're good to go, Dad," Steve said, giving the car's seat one final shake to demonstrate its stability. "This thing isn't going anywhere." But I wasn't done. Not even close. Clara mentioned wanting professional photos after the birth, so I researched newborn photographers like I was hiring a Supreme Court justice. I interviewed 3 different photographers, looked at thousands of sample photos, and eventually booked sessions with someone who charged more per hour than I made in a day, but promised timeless, artistic captures of your precious moments. The postpartum care was where I really went overboard. I hired a doula, one of those mystical birth goddess types who promised to help Clara through labor and provide support during those first crucial weeks. I arranged for a meal delivery service to bring us healthy, organic dinners for the first month. I even booked a night nurse for the first 2 weeks because I'd read somewhere that sleep deprivation was a major factor in postpartum depression, and I wanted Clara to have every possible advantage. My coworker Jared, who had 3 kids of his own and apparently possessed the wisdom that comes from surviving multiple rounds of fatherhood, tried to talk some sense into me during one of our lunch breaks. "Marcus, man, you're going a little overboard here," he said, unwrapping his bologna sandwich with the casual confidence of someone who'd learned to pick his battles. "Don't let her bleed you dry before the baby even gets here. Kids need love and attention more than they need expensive shit." But I just laughed him off. "Come on, Jared. This is my first kid. We want to do it right." "Doing it right doesn't mean buying out the entire baby store," he replied. "My first kid slept in a hand-me-down crib and wore his cousin's old onesies, and he turned out fine. Better than fine. Actually, he's in college now on a scholarship." I appreciated Jared's perspective, I really did, but he didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish here. This wasn't just about preparing for a baby. This was about proving something. To Clara, to myself, to the universe. I was showing everyone that I could provide, that I was ready to be a father, that our child would want for nothing. Every purchase felt like a declaration of love, a promise I was making to my unborn kid. The expensive organic cotton sheets whispered, "Daddy will make sure you're comfortable." The state-of-the-art baby monitor system said, "Daddy will always be watching over you." The top-of-the-line breast pump, because Clara wanted to try breastfeeding, announced, "Daddy supports all of Mommy's choices." Clara seemed happy enough with my preparations, though I noticed she was increasingly distracted during our shopping trips. She'd pick out items with a kind of absent-minded efficiency, nodding along with my enthusiastic explanations of various product features, but never really engaging with the process the way I thought she would. When I'd ask her opinion on something, like whether we should get the deluxe diaper-changing station or the premium model, she'd usually just say, "Whatever you think is best, Marcus." Whatever I thought was best. At the time, I interpreted this as trust, as Clara recognizing my dedication and letting me take the lead on preparing for our child. Now I realize it was probably more like indifference, like she was going through the motions while her mind was somewhere else entirely. But I didn't see it then. I was too busy being super dad, too focused on creating the perfect environment for our perfect baby to notice that my wife was already checking out of our perfect life. You know how in those cheesy romance movies, they always show the moment when everything starts falling apart in slow motion? The camera zooms in on someone's face as they realize their perfect world is crumbling, dramatic music swells, and you can practically see their heart breaking in real time? Well, real life isn't nearly that cinematic. Real life is more like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Tiny, seemingly insignificant moments that slowly bleed you dry until you wake up one day and realize you're living with a complete stranger. That's what happened with Clara and me during what should have been the most exciting months of our lives. While I was busy building cribs and researching baby gear like some kind of nesting maniac, my wife was slowly but surely disappearing right in front of my eyes. And like the oblivious jackass I apparently am, I kept making excuses for every red flag until I had more excuses than a politician caught with his pants down. It started with dinner conversations, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Clara and I used to talk about everything. Work drama, stupid shit we'd seen on social media, plans for the weekend, random thoughts that popped into our heads. We'd sit at our kitchen table for an hour sometimes, just talking and laughing like we actually enjoyed each other's company. But somewhere around month 5 of her pregnancy, those conversations dried up faster than a puddle in the desert. "How was your day?" I'd ask, settling into my chair with whatever culinary masterpiece I'd thrown together. And I was cooking a lot more by then. Partly because Clara's energy levels were shot, and partly because I'd read somewhere that pregnant women needed extra nutrition, and I was determined to be the most supportive husband in the history of marriage. Fine, she'd say, not even looking up from her phone. Anything interesting happen at work? Not really. How are you feeling? Baby giving you any trouble today? I'm okay. It was like trying to have a conversation with a particularly uninterested teenager. One-word answers, zero eye contact, and this general vibe that she'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet than sitting at a table with her loving, devoted husband. But hey, she was pregnant, right? Hormones were probably making her moody. That's what all the books said anyway. The weekends were when things got really weird. Before David's miraculous reappearance, Clara and I used to spend our Saturdays together, sleeping in, making breakfast, maybe hitting up the farmer's market, or working on little projects around the house. Sunday mornings were for lazy coffee and reading the paper, afternoon naps, and generally acting like the disgustingly content married couple we thought we were. But suddenly, Clara had all these mysterious plans with friends. She'd be gone for hours at a time, usually returning home around dinner time with this glow about her that I hadn't seen in months. Not the pregnancy glow they talk about in magazines. This was different. This was the glow of someone who'd been somewhere better, with someone more interesting, doing something more exciting than hanging out with her boring husband. How was your girl's day? I'd ask when she walked through the door, because I'm apparently a masochist who enjoys asking questions I don't really want the answers to. Really good, she'd say, and there was something about the way she said it that made my stomach drop. Like she was surprised to remember how good life could feel. We went to that new cafe downtown, did some shopping, you know. But here's the thing. I knew most of Clara's friends, and half of them were either busy with their own kids or lived in different cities. The other half weren't exactly the type to spend entire Saturdays cafe hopping and shopping. So who were these mysterious friends, and why hadn't I heard their names before? I didn't ask, though, because asking would have made me sound paranoid and controlling, and I was still desperately clinging to the delusion that I was the understanding, supportive husband who trusted his wife completely, even when that trust was starting to feel like a noose around my neck. The real kicker came when I started offering to help with basic pregnancy stuff. You know, the kind of supportive partner activities that every pregnancy book recommends. I'd suggest going to prenatal appointments together, maybe taking a birthing class, or just spending time working on the nursery as a team. Simple, wholesome, let's prepare for our baby together type activities. Want me to come with you to Dr. Martinez's office next week? I asked one evening while Clara was scrolling through her phone with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for brain surgery. Actually, David's going to drive me, she said without even looking up. His schedule is more flexible than yours. David. Of course it was David. Because apparently, my job, the job that was paying for all her medical expenses, by the way, was too inflexible to accommodate something as trivial as my wife's prenatal appointments. But Mr. Fitness trainer could rearrange his schedule of teaching rich ladies how to do squats properly. I could take the afternoon off, I offered, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. Don't be silly, Clara said, finally glancing up with that patronizing smile that married people use when they're trying to shut down a conversation. You work so hard already. Besides, David doesn't mind. David doesn't mind. Well, isn't that fucking fantastic? The guy who'd walked away from 2 marriages was perfectly happy to play supportive partner to my pregnant wife while I was busting my ass to provide for our family. It got worse. When I suggested we paint the nursery together, you know, one of those cute couple activities that would give us something to bond over, Clara informed me that she and David had already taken care of it. When I asked, because as far as I knew, our nursery walls were still the same boring beige they'd been since we moved in. Last weekend, she said casually, like she was discussing the weather, while you were at Leo's helping him with his deck project. So while I was being a good friend and neighbor, helping Leo rebuild his back deck, because that's what decent people do for each other, my wife was playing house with her ex-boyfriend in what was supposed to be our baby's room. They'd spent an entire afternoon together, probably laughing and reminiscing about the good old days while slapping paint on walls that I was paying for. What color did you pick? I asked, because apparently I hate myself. A nice soft yellow, she said. David thought it would be perfect for either a boy or a girl. David thought. David fucking thought. Because apparently, David's opinion on our baby's nursery was more important than mine. The guy who'd be gone the moment things got difficult had more say in our child's environment than the father who'd been planning and preparing and saving for months. But the absolute worst part, the thing that made me want to put my fist through the drywall I'd installed myself, was how happy Clara looked when she talked about these adventures with David. Her face would light up, her voice would get animated, and for just a moment, she'd look like the woman I'd fallen in love with. Except that woman was apparently only available when discussing another man. Every night, I'd lie in bed next to my wife, this stranger who looked like Clara but acted like someone I'd never met, and wonder what the hell had happened to us. Here we were, supposedly preparing for the biggest moment of our lives together, and I felt more alone than I had when I was actually single. But I kept telling myself it was temporary. Pregnancy hormones, stress, pre-baby anxiety, anything except the truth that was staring me right in the face. My wife was falling for someone else, and I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. 2 weeks before our baby was due to arrive, Clara dropped a bombshell that made Hiroshima look like a fucking firecracker. I'd been having this weird feeling all day. You know that sensation when your gut is trying to tell you something your brain doesn't want to hear? Like when you're walking down a dark alley and every instinct you have is screaming danger, but you keep telling yourself you're just being paranoid. That was me for about 72 hours straight, watching my wife move around our house like she was planning something. It was a Thursday evening, and I'd just gotten home from what had been a particularly brutal day installing crown molding for some neurotic rich lady who'd changed her mind about the design 3 times and acted like I was personally responsible for ruining her vision of domestic perfection. I was tired, my back was killing me, and all I wanted was a beer, some dinner, and maybe a quiet evening with my pregnant wife talking about baby names or nursery finishing touches. You know, normal shit that normal couples do when they're about to become parents. But Clara had other plans. She was sitting at our kitchen table, that same table I'd built with my own hands from reclaimed barnwood, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment who likes to surround himself with reminders of better times, and she had this look on her face that made my blood run cold. Not nervous, not upset, but determined, like she'd been rehearsing this moment in her head for weeks, and had finally worked up the courage to pull the trigger. She'd made tea, which should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong, because Clara never made tea unless she was either sick or about to deliver bad news. The fancy stuff too, not the cheap bags we usually used, but the loose-leaf chamomile that she saved for special occasions. She was trying to create some kind of calm, civilized atmosphere for whatever nuclear bomb she was about to drop on our marriage. "Marcus," she said, and her hands were shaking as she lifted the teacup to her lips. "I need to talk to you about something important." And there it was. The moment every married man dreads. When your wife says she needs to talk about something important, and you know with absolute certainty that your life is about to get turned inside out like a sock in the washing machine. I sat down across from her, trying to keep my expression neutral while my brain started cycling through every possible disaster scenario. "Okay," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? "What's up?" She took another sip of tea, set the cup down with exaggerated care, and looked me straight in the eyes with the kind of resolve that people usually reserve for confessing to war crimes. "I've been thinking about the birth," she said, "and I've decided I don't want you in the delivery room." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. For a moment, I literally couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at this woman who looked like my wife, but was saying things that made absolutely no fucking sense. I'd been planning for this moment for months, reading about how to be a supportive birth partner, practicing breathing exercises, researching everything I could about labor and delivery so I could be there for Clara when she needed me most. "What do you mean?" I managed to croak out, though I was pretty sure I already knew exactly what she meant, and my brain was just desperately hoping for some kind of misunderstanding that would make this conversation less catastrophic. Clara took a deep breath, like she was about to dive into deep water, and continued with the kind of calm certainty that made me want to flip the table and scream until my lungs gave out. "I want David there instead," she said. "He should be the first to hold the baby. He's been my rock through this pregnancy, Marcus. He understands what I need in ways that, well, in ways that you don't." The room started spinning. "Seriously, I felt like I was on some kind of fucked up carnival ride where the entire world had suddenly tilted sideways and nothing made sense anymore. My wife, my pregnant wife, carrying what I thought was our child, wanted her ex-boyfriend to be the first person to hold our baby. Not me, the husband who'd been working extra hours to pay for everything. Not me, the guy who'd been reading pregnancy books and building nursery furniture and planning for this moment since the day she peed on that little plastic stick. David fucking Cross, the fitness trainer who'd waltzed back into our lives like some kind of romantic movie hero and apparently stolen my entire family while I was busy being a responsible adult. Are you out of your goddamn mind? I said, and I could hear my voice getting louder, but I couldn't seem to control it. That's my baby, Clara. My child. I'm the one who's been here through everything. The morning sickness, the cravings, the late-night trips to get you ice cream. I'm the one who built the nursery, bought all the baby gear, arranged for the doula and the meal service and everything else. And you want some other guy to hold my kid before I do. But Clara just sat there with this serene expression, like she was explaining basic math to a particularly slow child. It's not about you, Marcus, she said, which might have been the most infuriating thing anyone had ever said to me in my entire life. This is about me and what I need to feel supported during one of the most important moments of my life. David gets me in ways that you just don't understand. David gets her. David fucking gets her. I wanted to ask what exactly David got that I didn't, besides free access to my wife and apparently my parental rights, but I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. What does that make me then? I asked, and I could feel something breaking inside my chest, something that had been holding our marriage together through all the late-night texts and mysterious weekend trips, an increasingly obvious emotional affair. A paycheck? Just some guy who pays the bills while you play house with your high school boyfriend. Clara's expression softened for just a moment, like maybe she was finally realizing how completely insane this conversation was. But then her face hardened again, and she said the words that would replay in my head for months. Please don't make this about you, Marcus. This is about me and my baby. My baby. Not our baby. My baby. Like I was just some random sperm donor who'd served his biological purpose and could now be discarded in favor of the real love of her life. I stared at this woman I'd been married to for 4 years, this woman I'd built a life with, this woman who was carrying what I'd thought was our child, and realized I didn't know her at all. The Clara I'd fallen in love with, the Clara I'd married, the Clara I'd been planning to raise a family with. That person had apparently never existed. Or maybe she had existed, but David's reappearance had awakened some part of her that had been dormant during our entire relationship, some version of herself that she'd been suppressing while she settled for boring, reliable Marcus. So that's it then, I said, standing up from the table because I couldn't sit still anymore. 4 years of marriage, months of preparing for this baby, and you just decide that your ex-boyfriend gets to play daddy while I watch from the sidelines. It's just the birth, Marcus, she said, like that was supposed to make it better. After that, everything goes back to normal. Normal, right? Because there's nothing abnormal about your wife choosing another man to witness the birth of your child. Nothing weird about being replaced by your wife's first love at the most important moment of your life as a father. I looked at Clara sitting there so calmly, so certain that what she was asking was reasonable, and realized that our marriage had been over for months. I just hadn't been paying attention. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, turns out I prefer mine served at room temperature with a side of financial reality and a generous helping of play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Because after Clara dropped that bombshell about wanting David to hold our baby first, something inside me just clicked. Not snapped. That would imply some kind of emotional breakdown. No, this was more like a switch being flipped, a moment of perfect clarity where I finally understood exactly what needed to happen next. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't throw myself at Clara's feet and plead with her to reconsider, which probably would have been the normal response for a guy who'd just been told his wife preferred her ex-boyfriend's presence over his own during the birth of their child. Instead, I did something that apparently surprised everyone, including myself. I went completely fucking tactical. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was lying awake crying or having some kind of emotional crisis, but because I was busy planning. See, here's the thing about being a carpenter. You learn to think systematically. You measure twice, cut once. You understand that every action has consequences, And if you want to build something that lasts, you need to have a solid foundation. Well, Clara and David had just demolished the foundation of my marriage, so it was time to rebuild something new. Something with clearly defined boundaries and consequences that even a fitness trainer and a delusional pregnant woman could understand. The next morning, while Clara was still sleeping off whatever hormonal cocktail had convinced her that her request was reasonable, I got up early and made myself a pot of coffee. Not the fancy stuff Clara liked, but the cheap, strong shit that actually wakes you up and helps you think clearly. Then I sat down at my laptop and got to work. First stop, the baby registry. You remember that registry, right? The one I'd spent weeks carefully curating, adding every possible item our child might need, from basic necessities to those luxury items that would make Clara's life easier during those first difficult months. The registry that represented months of research, comparison shopping, and financial planning. Well, guess what happens when Daddy isn't invited to the birth? Daddy's credit card doesn't get to play either. Click, click, click. Cancel, cancel, cancel. The deluxe crib that converted into a toddler bed? Gone. The state-of-the-art stroller system that could survive a zombie apocalypse? Refunded. The organic cotton sheets and hypoallergenic mattress? See you later. The expensive breast pump that was supposed to make nursing easier? Not my problem anymore. Every single item that I'd purchased, every contribution I'd made to our child's future comfort and safety, all of it disappeared with a few mouse clicks. But I wasn't done. Oh no, I was just getting warmed up. Because if David was going to play Daddy in the delivery room, then David could damn well take on all the financial responsibilities that come with that privilege. I spent the next hour on the phone, calling every vendor, every service provider, every business that was expecting payment from Marcus Hale. Hi, this is Marcus Hale calling about account number. I'd start each conversation with the kind of professional politeness that comes from years of dealing with difficult customers. I need to make some changes to the billing information. The meal delivery service that was supposed to bring us healthy dinners for the first month after the baby arrived. Please transfer the account to David Cross. Here's his contact information. The night nurse who was going to help Clara get some sleep during those first crucial weeks. Actually, Mr. Cross will be handling the payments for that service now. The professional photographer who was going to capture those precious first moments. Change of plans. David Cross is the new point of contact. Each phone call was like a small act of justice. Every transferred bill, every canceled service, every financial responsibility that moved from my name to David's felt like I was finally standing up for myself after months of being treated like a wallet with legs. The postpartum doula was probably my favorite call. This woman, Linda something or other, had spent an hour on the phone with me weeks earlier, explaining how her services would provide invaluable support during Clara's recovery. She'd quoted me rates that made my eyes water, but I'd agreed because I wanted Clara to have every possible advantage. Mr. Hale, Linda said when I called to make the change, are you sure about this? We had everything arranged. I'm absolutely certain, I told her. David Cross will be taking over all financial responsibilities related to the birth and postpartum period. He's very involved in this pregnancy. I could hear the confusion in her voice, but to her credit, she was professional enough not to ask questions. Well, if that's what you prefer, I'll need to speak with Mr. Cross directly to arrange payment. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear from you, I said, and I meant every word. The hospital bills were trickier since most of the prenatal care had already been billed to my insurance, but I called anyway and made sure that any additional charges related to labor, delivery, and postpartum care would be directed to David's attention. Let him figure out how to navigate the American healthcare system while juggling his personal training sessions. By noon, I'd systematically transferred every single financial obligation related to our baby's birth and early care to David Cross. The crib he'd helped Clara pick out? His problem now. The car seat I'd spent hours learning to install properly? Hope he's got good insurance. The organic baby food service, the diaper subscription, the lactation consultant, all of it was now David's responsibility. My sister Rachel called me around lunchtime, probably expecting to find me in the middle of some kind of emotional breakdown. Instead, she found me in my workshop, calmly sanding a piece of oak and listening to classic rock like it was just another day. Marcus, she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. I heard what happened. Are you okay? I'm fantastic, I told her, and I actually meant it. I'm finally making some progress on that entertainment center I've been meaning to build. But Clara, the baby, what are you going to do? Nothing, I said, running my hand along the smooth wood grain. David wanted to be the hero, so now he gets to be the hero. Heroes pay for their own adventures. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Rachel started laughing. Not the kind of sympathetic chuckle you give someone who's clearly lost their mind, but genuine, appreciative laughter. Holy shit, Marcus, she said. You actually did it. You're finally making them pay for the respect they took from you. And that's exactly what I was doing. For months, I'd been treated like a supporting character in my own life, like the reliable guy who pays the bills while the real romance happens between other people. Well, if I wasn't good enough to witness the birth of my own child, then I sure as hell wasn't good enough to pay for it either. The best part? I felt completely at peace with my decision. No guilt, no second-guessing, no wondering if maybe I was being too harsh. Clara had made her choice, and now she got to live with the consequences. Sometimes the only way to teach people about respect is to show them what happens when they don't have it. The silence was fucking beautiful. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had complete and total silence. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence that happens when you're fighting with someone you love, but the peaceful, healing kind of silence that comes when you finally stop banging your head against a brick wall and realize you can just walk around it instead. I found out about the birth the way any self-respecting man finds out about major life events these days, through social media. Not a phone call from my wife, not a text message, not even a fucking carrier pigeon. Nope, I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break, eating a turkey sandwich in my truck and minding my own business, when boom, there it was. A photo posted by some mutual friend who apparently thought I'd want to see a picture of my wife's ex-boyfriend holding what was supposed to be my child. The photo was everything you'd expect from a carefully staged social media moment designed to make everyone believe in true love and second chances. There was David, looking like he'd just won the lottery, cradling this tiny little human with the kind of expression that said, "Look at me. I'm a natural at this dad thing." Clara was in the hospital bed behind him, looking exhausted but somehow glowing, like she'd just accomplished something amazing instead of completely destroying her marriage for a nostalgic high school romance. The caption read, "Welcome to the world, baby Emma. So grateful for David's support during this incredible journey. Hashtag blessed, hashtag new beginnings, hashtag true love. Emma." They'd named her Emma without even asking me. Not that I'd expected to be consulted, considering I'd been officially demoted from husband and father to that guy who used to pay for things in Clara's mind. But still, seeing my daughter's name for the first time on a Facebook post while eating a gas station sandwich in a Home Depot parking lot wasn't exactly how I'd imagined this moment would go. My phone started buzzing immediately. Text after text, call after call, everyone suddenly very concerned about my mental state and eager to make sure I knew what was happening. Because apparently, in the age of social media, you can't even have a private family crisis without it becoming community entertainment. "Marcus, I just saw the post. Are you okay? Dude, what the hell is going on? Call me back. I'm worried about you. Marcus, this is insane. Please tell me you're not seeing this shit." But I didn't answer any of them. I turned my phone to silent, finished my sandwich, and went back to work. Because that's what you do when your life implodes on a Tuesday afternoon. You measure twice, cut once, and keep building whatever you're building until quitting time. The days that followed were a masterclass in the power of strategic silence. Clara called constantly. Text messages came in waves, starting desperate and progressively becoming more frantic as she realized I wasn't going to respond with the dramatic emotional reaction she was probably expecting. "Marcus, please call me back. I know you're upset, but we need to talk. The baby is beautiful. She has your eyes. Please don't punish her for my mistakes. Marcus, this is ridiculous. You're being petty and childish. I'm at the hospital with our daughter, and you're nowhere to be found. What kind of father does this? What kind of father does this?" That one almost made me laugh. The kind of father who gets replaced by his wife's ex-boyfriend, apparently. The kind of father who isn't good enough to witness his own child's birth, but is somehow still expected to foot the bill for everyone else's happiness. I deleted every message without reading them fully. Each deletion felt like a small victory, a tiny act of self-preservation in a world that had suddenly decided I was the villain for refusing to bankroll my own humiliation. The calls from David were even more entertaining. This guy, who'd been screwing around with my pregnant wife for months, suddenly wanted to have man-to-man conversations about doing what's right for the baby. I let every single call go to voicemail and eventually deleted them without listening. Whatever David Cross had to say to me, I guaranteed it wasn't worth hearing. Instead of dealing with the chaos I'd left behind, I threw myself into work with an intensity that probably worried my coworkers but kept me sane. I'd show up early, stay late, and lose myself in the kind of precise, methodical work that requires complete focus. Measuring boards, cutting joints, sanding surfaces until they were smooth as glass. There's something deeply satisfying about creating something beautiful and functional with your own hands when everything else in your life has turned to shit. My workshop became my sanctuary. I'd come home from job sites and immediately disappear into the garage, working on personal projects by the light of my workbench lamp while my phone buzzed uselessly in the house. I built a bookshelf, refinished an old dresser, and started work on a dining room table that was probably too nice for my current living situation, but gave me something to focus on besides the fact that my marriage had collapsed. Jared, my coworker who'd warned me about letting Clara bleed me dry, tried to check on me a few times during those first weeks. He'd find excuses to work near me on job sites, making casual conversation while clearly fishing for information about my mental state. "You doing okay, man?" he asked one afternoon while we were installing kitchen cabinets in some lawyer's McMansion. "Haven't seen you at lunch lately." "I'm fine," I told him, focusing on getting the measurements exactly right. "Just busy. If you need to talk." "I don't." And that was the truth. I didn't need to talk, didn't need sympathy, didn't need anyone's advice about how to handle my situation. What I needed was the silence I'd finally found, the peace that came from not participating in other people's drama. The only person whose calls I answered was Rachel, mainly because she had a key to my house and would probably show up anyway if I ignored her long enough. "How are you holding up?" she asked during one of our brief check-ins. "Better than expected," I told her, and I meant it. Turns out there's something to be said for not giving a shit about things you can't control. "Have you seen the baby?" "Nope." "Are you planning to?" "When I'm ready. On my terms." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I'm proud of you. You're handling this better than most guys would." Maybe she was right. Maybe most guys would have shown up at the hospital, caused a scene, begged their wives to reconsider. Maybe most guys would have tried to fight for their marriages, their parental rights, their dignity. But I wasn't most guys. I was Marcus Hale, and I'd finally learned the value of silence. Reality, as it turns out, is a real son of a bitch. It has this nasty habit of showing up uninvited to the party, usually right when everyone's having the most fun pretending that consequences don't exist. And boy, did reality decide to crash Clara and David's little love fest with all the subtlety of a freight train hitting a smart car. It started about 2 weeks after Emma was born, right around the time when the magical newborn bubble starts to deflate and parents realize that babies are adorable little tyrants who don't give a shit about your sleep schedule, your bank account, or your romantic fantasies. That's when my phone started ringing with a different tone entirely. Gone were the angry, demanding calls where Clara acted like I was the unreasonable one for not wanting to bankroll my own humiliation. These new calls had a distinct note of panic, the kind of desperate edge that comes when someone suddenly realizes they're in way over their head. "Marcus," Clara said during one of the many voicemails I didn't bother returning, "the hospital is asking about payment for the delivery room charges. David's insurance didn't cover everything, and they're saying there's a balance of $3,000. Can you please call me back?" $3,000. For someone who made her living training rich housewives how to do yoga poses, that was probably like asking him to fund a space mission. I could practically hear David's perfectly sculpted jaw hitting the floor when he realized that playing daddy came with actual financial obligations that couldn't be solved with protein shakes and motivational speeches about finding your inner warrior. But I didn't call back. Instead, I did something that probably would have gotten me nominated for Petty Asshole of the Year if that was an actual award category. I kept working on my dining room table project. There's something deeply therapeutic about hand-sanding oak when your ex-wife is discovering that her knight in shining armor has the financial stability of a house of cards in a windstorm. The voicemails kept coming, each one a little more desperate than the last. Marcus, please. The doula is threatening to send our account to collections if we don't pay her by Friday. David's been trying to figure out the payment, but his credit cards are maxed out from some business investment that didn't work out. Of course they were. Because guys who abandon 2 marriages and spend their lives chasing the next quick fix aren't exactly known for their long-term financial planning. Who could have seen that coming? Oh wait, literally everyone except Clara, who was apparently too busy reliving her high school glory days to notice that Prince Charming was basically a broke fitness instructor with commitment issues. The night nurse wants payment up front before she'll start working with us. David's trying to get a loan, but the bank is asking for documentation he doesn't have. A loan. David Cross, the man who was supposedly Clara's rock through her pregnancy, was trying to get a fucking payday loan to cover the expenses of being a hero. I had to admire the guy's commitment to the bit, even if his execution was more financial disaster than romantic gesture. The really entertaining calls started around week 3, when the sleep deprivation and money problems began to take their toll on Paradise. Clara's voice had taken on this frayed quality, like someone who hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch and was starting to question some major life choices. Marcus, Emma's been crying nonstop. The doctor says it's colic, but David doesn't know how to handle it. He keeps leaving when she cries too much because he says it stresses him out. I'm losing my mind here. Ah, there it was. The first crack in the fairy tale. Turns out Mr. Fitness Perfect wasn't so perfect when faced with a screaming infant at 3 in the morning. Who could have predicted that a guy who'd walked away from 2 marriages might not have the patience and commitment required for raising a child? Shocking, truly shocking. I learned most of this secondhand through my friend Jared, who had apparently become the unofficial town crier for my domestic drama. Jared's wife was friends with someone who worked at the gym where David trained clients, and information travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves someone's very public romantic meltdown. Word is that David's been calling in sick to work, Jared told me during one of our lunch breaks. Apparently, the baby's crying is affecting his sleep, and he can't function properly during training sessions. His boss isn't happy. Can't function properly. The guy who was supposedly Clara's perfect partner, the man who understood her needs better than her own husband, couldn't handle a crying baby. I'd read enough parenting books to know that colic was temporary, usually lasting a few months at most. But apparently, David's commitment to fatherhood had an expiration date that coincided with his need for 8 hours of uninterrupted beauty sleep. There's more, Jared continued, clearly enjoying his role as bearer of gossip. My wife heard that Clara's been showing up at the grocery store looking like she hasn't showered in days, buying formula and baby supplies by herself. David's nowhere to be seen. Of course he wasn't. Because playing daddy is fun when it involves holding a sleeping baby for photo ops and getting praised for being such a natural, but it's significantly less appealing when it involves 4 a.m. feedings, diaper blowouts, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you question your life choices. The most pathetic call came at the end of week 3. Clara's voice was so broken, so completely defeated, that for a split second I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Marcus, I know I have no right to ask this, but Emma's been sick. She's had a fever for 2 days, and the pediatrician wants to run some tests. David said he needed some space to think about things. He's staying at his sister's place until the baby gets better. I'm all alone here, and I don't know what to do. Space to think. The universal man code for this relationship is way more complicated than I thought it would be, and I'm going to disappear until someone else fixes all the problems. David had signed up for the romance and excitement of stealing another man's wife, not the unglamorous reality of actually raising a child. And now that things had gotten difficult, he was doing what guys like David always do, running away. But here's the thing that probably made me a terrible person. Instead of feeling vindicated or angry, I felt something much worse. I felt nothing. Absolutely fucking nothing. Clara could have told me that David had run off to join the circus, and I would have had the same emotional response as if she'd told me about the weather. The woman who'd spent months choosing another man over me, who'd decided that her ex-boyfriend should witness the birth of our daughter, who'd systematically excluded me from every major moment of my child's early life, was now dealing with the consequences of her choices. And I was supposed to feel, what? Sympathy? Obligation? The urge to ride in like some kind of backup hero and save the day? Nope, not happening. I had exactly one response to Clara's increasingly desperate situation. The same response I'd been giving her for weeks. Complete and total silence. Because sometimes the best way to teach someone about consequences is to let them experience them fully, without interference, without rescue, without someone else swooping in to fix what they broke. Clara had made her bed. Now she got to lie in it. Alone. 3 weeks after Emma was born, Clara showed up at my workshop like a ghost from a life I used to live. I heard the car door slam outside around 6 in the evening while I was putting the finishing touches on that dining room table I'd been working on. The one that was probably too nice for my current situation, but had kept me sane through the whole shitstorm. I knew it was her before I even looked up because I recognized the sound of her old Honda's door, the way it creaked and protested like everything else in our former life together. I didn't stop working, didn't rush to open the garage door or act surprised to see her. Just kept running the sandpaper along the oak grain in long, steady strokes while she stood outside gathering whatever courage she had left. Because that's what you do when someone who destroyed your life decides they need something from you. You make them wait. You make them work for it. When Clara finally knocked, it was the tentative tap of someone who wasn't sure they had the right to disturb you. Not the confident knock of a wife coming to see her husband, but the hesitant sound of a stranger asking for help from someone they'd wronged. I let her knock 3 times before I finally hit the button to raise the garage door. Jesus Christ, she looked like hell. And I don't mean that in some petty, vindictive way where I was happy to see her suffering. I mean, she literally looked like someone who'd been through a war and lost badly. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail that had given up trying to be functional. Her clothes. A stained t-shirt and sweatpants that had probably been cleaned sometime in the distant past. Hung off her like she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But it was her eyes that really got to me. Those same eyes that used to light up when she talked about David, that used to sparkle with excitement when she described their future together, now looked hollow and desperate, like someone who'd been awake for 72 hours straight and wasn't sure which way was up. In her arms was Emma, my daughter, the baby I'd been systematically excluded from meeting, the child whose birth had been treated like some kind of exclusive event that I wasn't important enough to attend. She was tiny, even smaller than I'd expected, wrapped in a pink blanket that looked expensive enough to be one of David's contributions to their perfect little family setup. Marcus, Clara said, and her voice cracked on my name like she wasn't sure she still had the right to use it. She was shaking. Whether from exhaustion, cold, or pure nerve failure, I couldn't tell. I know I don't deserve to be here. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I didn't say anything, just stood there in my work clothes, covered in sawdust, holding a piece of sandpaper and waiting for her to get to the point. Because that's another thing you learn as a carpenter. Sometimes the best response to someone's dramatic speech is to let them talk themselves into a corner while you figure out exactly what they want from you. Clara shifted Emma in her arms, and I caught a glimpse of the baby's face for the first time. She did have my eyes, the bastard. Same dark brown color, same serious expression that people always said made me look like I was thinking deep thoughts when really I was just trying to remember where I'd put my keys. It was unsettling how much she looked like me, considering how hard Clara had worked to make me irrelevant to her existence. David's gone, Clara continued, and there was something almost relieved in her voice, like she was finally admitting something she'd been trying not to think about. He left 2 days ago, said this was all too much, that he wasn't ready for the responsibility. His exact words were, "I signed up to be your boyfriend, not a father to someone else's kid." Someone else's kid. Even in his exit speech, David had managed to acknowledge what Clara had spent months pretending wasn't true, that Emma was my daughter, not his. The guy had been playing house with my wife, but when push came to shove, he couldn't handle the reality of raising another man's child. Shocking absolutely no one except Clara, apparently. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope that looked like it had been handled by someone with sweaty, nervous hands. The kind of envelope that contains bad news and desperation in equal measure. "The hospital bills," she said, holding it out to me like a peace offering or maybe a white flag of surrender. "The doula, the photographer, the meal service, all of it. David couldn't pay for any of it. He maxed out his credit cards trying to cover the initial expenses, and then when Emma got sick and needed those tests." She trailed off, probably realizing that explaining David's financial incompetence wasn't exactly helping her case. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Just held it while Clara continued her confession. I was wrong, Marcus. About everything. I thought David understood me better, thought he could give me something you couldn't. But he ran the moment things got difficult. You never would have done that. You never did do that, even when I gave you every reason to. She was crying now, the kind of ugly, exhausted crying that comes from someone who's been holding it together through pure willpower and finally reached the breaking point. I need you, she whispered. Emma needs you. You're her father, and I was an idiot for ever thinking David could replace that. I know I destroyed everything between us, and I know you probably hate me. But please, our daughter needs her daddy. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Clara had said something that mattered. Not, I'm sorry for the affair, or I made a mistake choosing David. She'd finally acknowledged that Emma was our daughter and that I was her father. It was probably 3 weeks too late and came only after her backup plan had completely collapsed, but it was something. I looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness for Clara. That was going to take a hell of a lot more than one desperate visit to my workshop. But something else. Something that had nothing to do with David or Clara or the months of betrayal, and everything to do with this tiny person who'd never asked to be born into this mess. You didn't have to earn this, Clara said, misinterpreting my silence for hesitation. You always deserved it. You were always the better man, the better choice. I just couldn't see it until it was too late. But I didn't answer right away, because I knew something Clara was just beginning to understand, something that had taken me weeks of silence and self-reflection to figure out. Love without respect is just manipulation with better marketing. And respect isn't something you can apologize your way back into. It's something you have to rebuild from the ground up, one honest action at a time. Sometimes the only way to teach the people closest to you what you're worth is to let them live with the consequences of treating you like you're worthless. Clara had learned that lesson the hard way. Now came the real question: what was I going to do with that knowledge?